Grizzly bear kills sheriff's deputy in 2 minutes. November 4th, 2024. Deputy Sheriff Alan Michael Rogers had been with the Flathead County Sheriff's Office for 11 years when he received the call that would end his life. At 6:47 a.m. on November 4th, 2024, the morning dispatcher Sarah Chen relayed a complaint from rancher Theodore Ted Walsh about another livestock attack at his property 15 miles northwest of Kalispell, Montana. Walsh's voice had been tight with controlled anger when he'd called in, reporting that something had torn through his fence line again and killed 2 of his prize Angus calves. Rogers, 43 years old, with steel-grey hair and weathered hands that spoke of his previous life as a ranch hand, had handled dozens of similar calls over the years. Born and raised in the Flathead Valley, he understood the delicate balance between human settlement and the wilderness that pressed in from all sides. His wife, Janet Rogers, often worried about the increasing frequency of wildlife encounters in their area, but Alan had always assured her that he knew how to handle himself in the backcountry. The morning was crisp, with temperatures hovering around 28 degrees Fahrenheit. A light snow had fallen during the night, leaving a pristine blanket across the valley floor and dusting the peaks of the Mission Mountains to the east and the Swan Range to the north. Rogers had grown up hunting and fishing in these mountains with his father, William Rogers, a retired Forest Service ranger who had instilled in him a deep respect for the wilderness and its inhabitants. As Rogers drove his patrol vehicle, a white Ford Explorer with the distinctive gold and blue markings of the Flathead County Sheriff's Office, north on Highway 35 toward Walsh's ranch, he mentally reviewed what he knew about the recent spate of livestock attacks. Over the past 6 weeks, there had been 7 separate incidents within a 20-mile radius. The Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Department had sent wildlife biologist Dr. Elizabeth Martinez to investigate the first few attacks, and her preliminary assessment suggested they were dealing with a large predator, likely a grizzly bear, preparing for hibernation. The Walsh Ranch sat on 800 acres of prime grazing land that bordered the Flathead National Forest. Theodore Walsh, 67 years old and a third-generation rancher, had been losing cattle to predators for over 40 years, but he'd told Rogers during their previous conversations that these recent attacks were different. The kill patterns were more aggressive, more destructive than typical bear predation. Where bears usually killed efficiently and consumed what they needed, this predator seemed to be killing for the sake of killing, leaving partially consumed carcasses scattered across his pastures. Rogers turned off Highway 35 onto the gravel road that led to Walsh's property. The road wound through dense stands of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, their branches heavy with snow. As he drove, he noticed fresh tracks in the snow alongside the road: deer, elk, and what might have been coyote prints. The ecosystem in this part of Montana was robust, supporting healthy populations of prey animals that, in turn, supported predators like mountain lions, black bears, and grizzly bears. Walsh's ranch house came into view at 7:23 a.m., a 2-story log structure with smoke rising from its chimney. The main barn and several outbuildings were clustered nearby, and beyond them stretched the pastures where Walsh ran his cattle operation. Rogers had known Ted Walsh for most of his adult life. Walsh's daughter, Rebecca Walsh Morrison, was married to Rogers' cousin, making the 2 men distant relatives by marriage. This personal connection had made the recent livestock attacks feel more urgent to Rogers. Walsh emerged from the ranch house as Rogers pulled up, his breath visible in the cold morning air. At 6 feet tall, with a salt and pepper beard and the slightly bow-legged walk of a lifelong horseman, Walsh looked every inch the Montana rancher. He'd been up since before dawn, checking his livestock and assessing the damage from the previous night's attack. "Morning, Alan," Walsh said, approaching the patrol vehicle. "Thanks for coming out so quick. This bastard hit me again last night, and I've about had enough." Rogers climbed out of his vehicle, automatically checking the position of his service weapon, a Glock 22.40 caliber pistol, in its holster. He also carried pepper spray specifically designed for bear encounters and a tactical flashlight, though the morning sun was already providing adequate visibility. "Morning, Ted. Show me what we're dealing with." The two men walked toward the northwest pasture, where Walsh kept his breeding stock. The snow crunched under their boots, and Rogers could already smell something that made his stomach turn, the metallic scent of blood and the sweet, cloying odor of death. As they crested a small hill, the scene of destruction came into view. Two young Angus calves, each weighing approximately 400 pounds, lay dead in the snow. The attack site told a story of violence that made Rogers pause. The fence line had been destroyed over a 20-foot section, with heavy wooden posts snapped off at ground level and barbed wire scattered like deadly confetti. The calves hadn't simply been killed, they'd been savaged. "Jesus Christ," Rogers muttered, pulling out his notebook to begin documenting the scene. The first calf lay on its side, its throat torn open in a wound that exposed vertebrae and windpipe. Massive claw marks scored its ribs, and one hind leg had been nearly severed. The second calf had been disemboweled, its entrails scattered across 15 feet of blood-soaked snow. Walsh stood nearby, his face grim. "I found them like this about an hour ago when I came out to do morning feed. Whatever did this was still eating when I first got here. I saw it disappear into the tree line over there." He pointed toward a dense stand of lodgepole pines that marked the beginning of Forest Service land. Rogers studied the tracks around the attack site. Even with his limited wildlife tracking experience, he could see that they were dealing with something massive. The paw prints in the snow measured nearly 12 inches long and 6 inches wide, with distinct claw marks extending another 3 inches beyond the pad impressions. These weren't black bear tracks, they were far too large. This was definitely a grizzly bear, and based on the size of the prints, it was a mature adult, possibly a male. "Have you seen any sign of cubs in the area?" Rogers asked, taking photographs of the scene with his department-issued camera. Bears with cubs were notoriously aggressive, especially during the pre-hibernation period, when they were desperately trying to build fat reserves. "No cubs that I've seen," Walsh replied. "But I'll tell you what worries me. I think this is the same bear that hit the Morrison place last week and the Johnson Ranch before that. The kill pattern is the same. Excessive violence, partial consumption, and it seems to target the youngest and most vulnerable animals." Rogers nodded, aware that Dr. Martinez had reached similar conclusions in her preliminary reports. The biologist had theorized that they were dealing with a problem bear, possibly an older male that had lost territory to younger, more aggressive bears, and was now ranging widely in search of easy prey. Such bears often became increasingly bold and dangerous as winter approaches. As Rogers continued documenting the scene, he noticed something that made him pause. Mixed in with the bear tracks were what appeared to be the prints of a much smaller animal, possibly a wolf or large coyote. The ecological dynamics of northwestern Montana included gray wolves, which had been reintroduced to the region in the 1990s. While wolves and grizzly bears typically avoided each other, desperate times could create unusual alliances or competition scenarios. "Ted, have you noticed any wolf activity in the area recently?" Rogers asked, crouching down to examine the smaller tracks more closely. Walsh walked over to see what had caught Rogers' attention. "Now that you mention it, I have been hearing more howling at night. My dog's been restless too, spending most nights whimpering and pacing around the house. I figured it was just because of the bear, but maybe there's more going on out there than I realized." Rogers made detailed notes about the secondary tracks and the potential for multiple predators in the area. This information would be crucial for Dr. Martinez and the Fish, Wildlife and Parks Department as they developed a management strategy for dealing with the problem bear. The presence of wolves could complicate any trapping or relocation efforts. As the two men worked their way around the attack site, Rogers' radio crackled to life. "Unit 7, this is dispatch. What's your status on the Walsh property?" Rogers keyed his radio. "Unit 7 to dispatch. I'm on scene conducting an investigation of a livestock attack. Appears to be grizzly bear predation. I'll need to contact Fish and Wildlife when I'm finished here." "Copy that, Unit 7. Be advised we've received another livestock attack report, this one at the Henderson Ranch, about 8 miles north of your current location. Similar circumstances reported." Rogers exchanged glances with Walsh. 2 attacks in one night, 8 miles apart. This suggested a bear that was ranging widely and actively hunting. "Copy, dispatch. I'll respond to the Henderson location after I complete the initial investigation here." The Henderson Ranch belonged to Marcus and Linda Henderson, a couple in their 50s who had moved to Montana from California 5 years earlier to pursue their dream of rural living. Unlike Ted Walsh, who had generations of experience dealing with predators, the Hendersons were still learning the harsh realities of ranching in grizzly bear country. Rogers spent another 30 minutes at Walsh's property, taking measurements, collecting photographic evidence, and creating a detailed sketch of the attack site. The bear's tracks led from the tree line straight to the fence, then continued beyond the attack site toward the northeast, in the general direction of the Henderson Ranch. The animal appeared to be following game trails and creek beds, using natural travel corridors that would provide cover while moving between hunting areas. Before leaving Walsh's property, Rogers called Dr. Elizabeth Martinez's office at the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Regional Headquarters in Kalispell. Martinez wasn't available, but her assistant, Jessica Coleman, took Rogers' detailed report and assured him that the biologist would be contacted immediately. "Dr. Martinez is going to want to get out there as soon as possible," Coleman said. "Based on what you're describing, this sounds like the same bear that's been causing problems throughout the valley. We may need to move to more aggressive management options." Rogers understood the implications of Coleman's statement. Aggressive management options was bureaucratic language for potentially lethal control measures. If the bear continued to pose a threat to livestock and potentially to human safety, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks would likely authorize its destruction. At 8:45 a.m., Rogers left Walsh's property and began the drive to the Henderson Ranch. The route took him deeper into the foothills of the Swan Range, where human development became increasingly sparse and the wilderness pressed closer to the scattered ranch properties. The Henderson place was accessed via a narrow dirt road that branched off from a Forest Service logging road, making it one of the more remote properties in the area. As he drove, Rogers reflected on the changing dynamics of human-wildlife interaction in the region. When he was growing up in the 1980s and 1990s, grizzly bear encounters were relatively rare. The bear population had been decimated by hunting and habitat loss throughout most of the 20th century, and the species had been listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in 1975. However, successful conservation efforts had led to a remarkable recovery, and grizzly bear numbers in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, which included Glacier National Park and the surrounding wilderness areas, had grown from perhaps 200 bears in the 1970s to over 1,000 today. This recovery, while a conservation success story, had also led to increased conflicts between bears and humans. As bear populations expanded, individual animals were forced to range more widely in search of territory and food resources. Younger bears in particular often found themselves pushed into marginal habitat at the edges of human development, where conflicts were inevitable. The Henderson Ranch came into view at 9:12 a.m., and Rogers immediately noticed that the situation here was even more severe than at Walsh's property. Marcus Henderson was waiting near the main gate, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly as he lit a cigarette. Henderson, 54 years old with greying brown hair and the soft physique of someone who had spent most of his career behind a desk, looked completely out of his element. He and his wife Linda had purchased the ranch with romantic notions of rural living, but the reality of predator management and livestock protection had proven more challenging than they had anticipated. "Deputy Rogers, thank God you're here," Henderson said, approaching the patrol vehicle. "This is worse than anything we've ever dealt with. The damn thing killed 4 of our sheep and injured 2 more. My wife is inside calling our insurance company, but I don't think they're going to cover this kind of loss." Rogers could already smell the carnage before he even got out of his vehicle. The metallic scent of blood was thicker here, mixed with the barnyard odors of sheep and hay. "Show me what happened, Mr. Henderson." The sheep had been penned in a fenced area behind the main barn, presumably for protection from predators. However, the bear had torn through the fence as if it were made of paper. Heavy wooden posts lay broken and scattered, and sections of field fencing had been rolled up and twisted into unrecognizable shapes. The gate, which had been secured with a heavy chain and padlock, had been ripped completely off its hinges. Inside the pen, the scene was one of absolute carnage. 4 adult sheep lay dead in various states of dismemberment. Unlike the relatively clean kills Rogers had seen at cattle operations, where bears typically killed efficiently and began feeding immediately, these sheep had been savaged with what appeared to be pure fury. Wool and blood were scattered across the entire pen area, and the surviving sheep huddled in the far corner, several bearing obvious wounds. "When did this happen?" Rogers asked, beginning his documentation process. "Sometime between midnight and 4 a.m., Henderson replied, his voice shaky. "Linda heard commotion outside around 2 in the morning, but I told her it was probably just coyotes. We've had problems with coyotes since we moved here. I didn't come out to check until I got up to do morning chores." Rogers studied the tracks around the pen. The same massive grizzly prints were evident, but here they were accompanied by signs of prolonged activity. The bear hadn't simply killed and moved on. It had spent considerable time in the pen, apparently killing multiple animals in sequence and then partially feeding on each carcass before moving to the next victim. "Has anyone from Fish and Wildlife been out to talk to you about bear safety measures?" Rogers asked, noting that the Hendersons had made virtually no effort to bear-proof their livestock operation. The sheep pen was located less than 50 feet from the tree line. There were no electric fences or other deterrents, and feed storage appeared to be minimal. Henderson looked embarrassed. "We got some pamphlets when we first moved here, but to be honest, we never thought we'd have problems this close to the house. The nearest neighbor said he'd never had bear trouble in 20 years of ranching here." This was unfortunately typical of newcomers to bear country. Many people moved to Montana with romantic notions of wildlife viewing and coexistence, without understanding the practical realities of living in one of the few places in the lower 48 states where large predators still roamed freely. Rogers spent over an hour documenting the Henderson attack site, taking photographs from multiple angles and making detailed measurements of tracks and damage. The bear's behavior pattern was becoming clearer. It was an animal that had lost its natural fear of humans and human-associated food sources. This was the classic definition of a problem bear that would likely require lethal management. At 10:30 a.m., Rogers received another radio call that made his blood run cold. "Unit 7, this is dispatch. We have a report of a possible bear sighting at Riverside Elementary School on Highway 82. Caller reports a large bear in the playground area. Units 4 and 6 are responding, but you're requested as backup due to your wildlife experience." Rogers felt his heart rate spike. Riverside Elementary School served approximately 180 children from kindergarten through 5th grade, drawn from the rural communities scattered throughout the northern Flathead Valley. A grizzly bear on school property represented the worst-case scenario for human-wildlife conflict. Unit 7 responding, Rogers radioed back. ETA 15 minutes. He quickly finished his documentation at the Henderson Ranch and assured Marcus Henderson that Fish and Wildlife would be contacted immediately about the situation. As he drove toward the school, Rogers mentally reviewed protocols for dealing with bears in populated areas. The primary goal was always public safety, which meant evacuating people from the area and calling in wildlife specialists with appropriate equipment for dealing with large predators. Riverside Elementary was a single-story brick building surrounded by playground equipment and open fields that backed up against Swan Creek and a corridor of riparian forest. It was exactly the kind of location where bears might naturally travel, following water sources and seeking the abundant fruit trees that had been planted around the school grounds as part of a beautification project several years earlier. When Rogers arrived at the school at 10:47 a.m., he found deputies Mike Sullivan and Tracy Webb had already established a perimeter around the building and were coordinating with school principal Janet Morrison to keep all students and staff inside. The bear was no longer visible, but fresh tracks in the snow around the playground equipment confirmed its presence. Principal Morrison, a woman in her early 40s with brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, met Rogers at the command post that had been established in the school parking lot. "Deputy Rogers, thank goodness you're here. We got the first sighting report at about 10:15 from a parent dropping off a late student. She saw what she described as a huge brown bear near the swing sets." Rogers examined the tracks around the playground. They were unmistakably the same prints he had been following all morning. The massive grizzly that had been terrorizing livestock operations throughout the valley had now moved into populated areas. This escalation changed everything in terms of management response. "Have any students or staff been outside since the sighting?" Rogers asked. "No, we implemented immediate lockdown procedures as soon as we got the first report," Morrison replied. "All exterior doors are locked and all outdoor activities are cancelled until we get an all-clear from your department." Rogers coordinated with deputies Sullivan and Webb to expand the search area around the school. Sullivan, a 15-year veteran with extensive search and rescue experience, took responsibility for checking the riparian area along Swan Creek. Webb, newer to the department but an accomplished hunter, began following the bear's tracks northward toward the forest boundary. At 11:15 a.m., Webb radioed that she had found additional sign about a quarter-mile north of the school. "Unit 6 to Unit 7. I've got scat and feeding sign up here. Looks like the bear spent some time feeding on chokecherries and service berries in this area. Tracks continue northwest toward Bear Creek drainage." Rogers felt a chill of recognition. Bear Creek drainage was a rugged canyon system that extended deep into the Flathead National Forest, but it also contained several remote cabin developments and seasonal residences. If the bear was moving in that direction, it could encounter any number of people who might be unaware of the danger. By noon, Dr. Elizabeth Martinez had arrived at the school with a team from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. Martinez, 45 years old with 20 years of experience in wildlife biology, was the region's leading expert on grizzly bear behavior and management. She immediately began coordinating with Rogers and the other deputies to develop a comprehensive response plan. "Based on what you've described, we're dealing with a food-conditioned adult male grizzly that's exhibiting increasingly aggressive behavior," Martinez told Rogers as they reviewed his documentation from the morning's livestock attacks. "The fact that it's moved into a school area represents a significant escalation of the threat level." Martinez explained that Fish and Wildlife would immediately deploy a team of specialists with equipment for tracking and potentially capturing the bear. However, given the animal's size, its demonstrated aggression, and its presence in populated areas, lethal control was becoming an increasingly likely outcome. "Our first priority has to be public safety," Martinez said. "We'll attempt non-lethal capture if possible, but if this bear shows any sign of aggression toward humans, we'll have to make the difficult decision to destroy it." Rogers understood the complexity of the situation. Grizzly bears were protected under federal law, and killing one required extensive documentation and justification. However, a bear that had lost its fear of humans and was actively seeking food in populated areas posed an unacceptable risk to public safety. At 12:30 p.m., Rogers received permission from Sheriff Thomas Bradley to continue following the bear's trail, while fish and wildlife teams established monitoring stations around the school and other sensitive areas. Bradley, a 30-year law enforcement veteran who had grown up in the Flathead Valley, understood both the ecological importance of grizzly bears and the reality that problem animals sometimes required lethal management. "Alan, I want you to stay with this situation as our department's liaison with fish and wildlife," Bradley told Rogers over the radio. "You've got more experience with this kind of call than anyone else on the department, and Dr. Martinez specifically requested that you continue to assist with the investigation." Rogers felt both honored and apprehensive about this assignment. While he had handled numerous wildlife calls over his 11 years with the Sheriff's Department, he had never been involved in tracking a problem grizzly bear of this size and apparent aggressiveness. The animal's behavior pattern suggested an unpredictable and potentially dangerous predator that could strike anywhere within its expanding territory. Following the bear's tracks northward from the school, Rogers found himself traveling through increasingly wild terrain. The trail led through a mixture of private land and Forest Service property, following natural travel corridors that connected different drainage systems. Along the way, he documented additional feeding sign and scat that confirmed Dr. Martinez's assessment that they were dealing with a large adult male bear in hyperphagia, the pre-hibernation feeding frenzy that drives bears to consume up to 20,000 calories per day. At 1:45 p.m., Rogers' radio crackled with an emergency call that made his heart stop. All units, we have a possible bear attack in progress at 1847 Bear Creek Road." Caller reports screaming and sounds of struggle from neighboring cabin. "Ambulance and backup requested immediately." Bear Creek Road was less than 2 miles from Rogers' current position, and the timing couldn't be coincidental. The problem bear had apparently encountered its first human victim. Rogers activated his emergency lights and siren and began racing toward the reported location, his patrol vehicle bouncing and sliding on the snow-covered forest roads. As he drove, he radioed for additional backup and confirmed that Dr. Martinez and her team were also responding to the scene. The address on Bear Creek Road belonged to a seasonal cabin development that was mostly empty during the November off-season. However, several year-round residents lived in the area, including retired couple Harold and Margaret Stevenson, who had moved to Montana from Minnesota 15 years earlier, seeking a quieter lifestyle. When Rogers arrived at 1847 Bear Creek Road at 2:03 p.m., he found a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cabin belonged to Harold Stevenson, 72 years old, who had apparently been outside splitting firewood when he encountered the bear. Stevenson's screams had been heard by his neighbor, retired teacher Dorothy Walsh, Ted Walsh's sister, who had called 911 from her cabin approximately 200 yards away. Rogers approached the scene carefully, his service weapon drawn and his pepper spray ready. The first thing he noticed was the silence. No human sounds, no bear sounds, just the whisper of wind through the pine trees and the distant sound of running water from Bear Creek. Harold Stevenson lay motionless in the snow near a pile of split firewood, approximately 30 feet from his cabin's front door. Even from a distance, Rogers could see that the man's injuries were catastrophic. His winter jacket had been shredded, and dark stains in the snow around his body told a grim story. The bear was nowhere to be seen, but fresh tracks in the snow led from the attack site toward the creek bottom. Rogers immediately established a perimeter around the area and called for emergency medical personnel, though it was clear that Stevenson was beyond help. Dr. Martinez arrived at 2:15 p.m. with a team of wildlife specialists equipped with tranquilizer guns and tracking equipment. She took one look at the scene and immediately upgraded the situation to a public safety emergency requiring lethal management of the bear. "This bear has now killed a human being," Martinez told Rogers grimly. "Under Montana law and federal wildlife management protocols, we have no choice but to track it down and destroy it immediately." The attack on Harold Stevenson represented every wildlife manager's worst nightmare. A grizzly bear that had progressed from livestock predation to human predation. Such bears were extremely dangerous because they had overcome their natural fear of humans and learned to view people as potential prey or competitors. Emergency medical personnel arrived at 2:28 p.m., but could only confirm what Rogers already knew. Harold Stevenson was dead, apparently from massive trauma to his neck and chest. The coroner would later determine that death had been nearly instantaneous, a small mercy given the horror of bear attacks. Margaret Stevenson, Harold's wife of 48 years, was found inside the cabin in a state of shock. She had witnessed the entire attack through her kitchen window, but had been unable to help her husband. Neighbor Dorothy Walsh had remained with her until emergency personnel arrived. "He was just splitting wood for our evening fire," Margaret Stevenson told Rogers through her tears. "That's all he was doing." This bear came out of nowhere, so fast, and Harold didn't even have time to run. Rogers spent the next hour coordinating with multiple agencies as the scope of the emergency response expanded. The Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Bear Management Team, led by specialist David Chen, had been called in from the state capital. The Flathead County Sheriff's Office had deployed additional deputies to establish security perimeters around the area. The local coroner, Dr. Patricia Williams, arrived to examine Stevenson's body and begin the official death investigation. Most significantly, word of the fatal bear attack had reached the media. By 4 p.m., reporters from television stations in Kalispell and Missoula were arriving at the scene, along with correspondents from regional newspapers. The story would eventually attract national attention, as fatal grizzly bear attacks were relatively rare events that captured public imagination. Rogers found himself serving as the primary law enforcement interface with the media, a role for which he had limited training, but which he handled with characteristic professionalism. He provided basic information about the ongoing investigation while being careful not to compromise the bear management operation that was now underway. "We are investigating a fatal wildlife encounter that occurred this afternoon in the Bear Creek area," Rogers told reporters during an impromptu press conference. "Montana Fish, Wildlife and Park specialists are currently tracking the animal responsible, and additional safety measures have been implemented throughout the region." The bear management team, meanwhile, had begun an intensive tracking operation using specially trained dogs and specialized equipment. The animal's tracks led from the Stevenson cabin into increasingly rugged terrain along Bear Creek, following game trails through dense timber and rocky outcroppings that would make pursuit difficult and dangerous. As evening approached, Rogers received word that he would be part of the tracking team that would attempt to locate and destroy the problem bear. Dr. Martinez had specifically requested his participation, citing his knowledge of the local area and his experience with the bear's movement patterns from earlier in the day. At 5:30 p.m., Rogers met with the tracking team at a command post that had been established at the Bear Creek trailhead. The team consisted of Dr. Martinez, bear management specialist David Chen, tracking dog handler Maria Santos with her specially trained Karelian bear dog named Bear, and 2 additional deputies from the sheriff's office. Chen, a compact man in his 30s with extensive experience in wildlife management, briefed the team on their mission. This bear has killed a human being and shown escalating aggressive behavior throughout the day. Our goal is to track it to its current location and destroy it using appropriate firearms. This is not a capture operation. This is a public safety response that requires lethal force. The team would be equipped with high-powered rifles suitable for taking down a large grizzly bear, as well as backup weapons, communication equipment, and emergency medical supplies. Given the approaching darkness and the difficult terrain, the operation would be challenging and potentially dangerous. Rogers had never participated in a bear hunt of this type, but his familiarity with the local terrain and his law enforcement experience made him a valuable member of the team. He also carried the legal authority to use lethal force if necessary to protect human life. The tracking operation began at 6:15 p.m., with Maria Santos's dog Bear leading the way along the grizzly's scent trail. Karelian bear dogs, originally bred in Finland for hunting large game, were specifically trained to track and bay bears without engaging them directly. Bear, a black and white male weighing about 45 pounds, had been working with Santos for 3 years and had assisted in numerous bear management operations. The trail led deeper into the Bear Creek drainage, following the creek bottom through stands of old-growth cedar and hemlock. The terrain was difficult, with fallen logs, steep banks, and areas of dense understory that limited visibility. As darkness fell, the team had to rely increasingly on flashlights and night vision equipment. At 7:45 p.m., Bear suddenly stopped and began showing intense interest in a dense thicket of serviceberry bushes about 50 yards ahead. Santos immediately called for the team to halt and prepare weapons. "He's close," Santos whispered to the team. "Bear's behavior indicates the grizzly is within a couple hundred yards, probably bedded down for the evening." Dr. Martinez made the decision to establish a perimeter around the area and wait until morning to make contact with the bear. Attempting to confront a grizzly bear in dense cover during darkness would be extremely dangerous, even for experienced wildlife professionals. "We'll maintain surveillance through the night and move in at first light," Martinez told the team. "This bear isn't going anywhere. It's found a good location with water, cover, and probably some residual food sources." Rogers volunteered to take the first watch, positioning himself approximately 100 yards upwind from where the bear was believed to be located. The November night was cold and clear, with temperatures dropping into the low 20s. He could hear the sounds of the wilderness around him, the splash of water over rocks in Bear Creek, the distant howl of coyotes, and the occasional call of a great horned owl. As he waited in the darkness, Rogers reflected on the events of the day and the tragedy that had befallen Harold Stevenson. Bear attacks were always shocking, but they were also part of the reality of living in grizzly bear habitat. The challenge for wildlife managers was balancing the conservation needs of a threatened species with the legitimate safety concerns of human residents. At 3:30 a.m., Rogers was relieved by Deputy Webb, who would maintain surveillance until dawn. He managed to catch a few hours of sleep in his patrol vehicle, but his rest was disturbed by dreams of massive claws and the memory of Harold Stevenson's body in the snow. Dawn on November 5th broke clear and cold, with temperatures at 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The tracking team reassembled at 6 a.m., and Maria Santos's dog immediately confirmed that the bear was still in the area. Bear showed intense interest in the same thicket where the scent had been strongest the previous evening. The approach would be methodical and careful. Dr. Martinez and David Chen, armed with high-powered rifles, would move to positions that provided clear shooting lanes into the thicket. Rogers and Deputy Webb would establish backup positions, while Santos would use her dog to pressure the bear out of cover. At 6:45 a.m., Santos released Bear to begin working the scent trail. The dog immediately moved toward the thicket, his hackles raised and his body language indicating extreme alertness. Within seconds, Bear began barking, the sharp, distinctive baying that indicated he had located his quarry. The response was immediate and terrifying. An enormous grizzly bear exploded out of the thicket with a roar that seemed to shake the ground. The animal was even larger than Rogers had imagined, easily 7 feet tall when rearing up on its hind legs, with massive shoulders and a head that seemed almost too large for its body. Dr. Martinez fired first, her rifle shot echoing through the canyon like thunder. The bear stumbled but remained upright, turning toward the sound of the gunshot with obvious fury. David Chen fired a second shot that struck the animal in the chest, but still it remained standing. Rogers had never seen anything like the power and resilience of this grizzly bear. Even with 2 rifle shots in its body, the animal was still mobile and apparently capable of attack. It was only when Chen fired a third shot, this one striking the bear in the head, that the massive predator finally collapsed. The entire encounter had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt like hours to Rogers. The silence that followed the gunshots was profound, broken only by the continued barking of Santos's dog and the sound of their own heavy breathing. Dr. Martinez approached the dead bear carefully, her rifle still ready in case the animal was only wounded. However, it was clear that the grizzly was dead. Chen's final shot had been perfectly placed, ending the bear's life instantly. The animal was truly massive. Later measurements would show it weighed 847 pounds and measured over 8 feet from nose to tail. This was an exceptionally large grizzly bear, probably in the top 5% of the population in terms of size. Its age was estimated at approximately 15 years old, making it a mature adult in its prime. "This is one of the largest grizzly bears I've ever seen," Dr. Martinez told Rogers as they examined the carcass. "An animal this size would be capable of incredible destruction, as we saw yesterday. It's a tragedy that it came to this, but there was no other option once it killed a human being." The bear's stomach contents, which would later be analyzed by fish and wildlife biologists, told the story of its final days. In addition to natural foods like berries and roots, the stomach contained fragments of barbed wire, pieces of plastic, and other debris that indicated the bear had been raiding human food sources and garbage. Rogers spent the remainder of November 5th helping to document the scene and coordinate the removal of the bear's carcass. The animal would be transported to the Fish and Wildlife Research Facility in Bozeman for a complete necropsy that would provide additional information about its health, age, and behavior patterns. News of the successful tracking operation spread quickly, bringing a sense of relief to residents throughout the northern Flathead Valley. However, the death of Harold Stevenson had cast a shadow over the community that would take much longer to heal. The funeral service for Harold Stevenson was held on November 8th at the Kalispell Methodist Church, with over 300 people in attendance. Rogers served as one of the honorary pallbearers, representing the law enforcement community's respect for Stevenson's memory and their commitment to public safety in bear country. Margaret Stevenson, Harold's widow, approached Rogers after the service to thank him for his efforts in tracking down the bear that had killed her husband. "I know Harold wouldn't want anyone else to go through what we went through," she told Rogers through her tears. "Thank you for making sure that Bear couldn't hurt anyone else." The investigation into the fatal bear attack continued for several weeks, with Rogers providing detailed reports to multiple agencies. The Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Department conducted a comprehensive review of the incident and concluded that all appropriate protocols had been followed. The bear had clearly posed an imminent threat to public safety, and lethal management had been justified. Dr. Martinez's final report on the incident provided insights into the factors that had led to the bear's aggressive behavior. The animal had been in poor body condition despite its large size, suggesting that it had been struggling to find adequate food sources in its natural habitat. Climate change and habitat fragmentation were forcing bears to range more widely in search of food, bringing them into increasing conflict with human development. The necropsy results revealed that the bear had been suffering from dental problems that may have made it difficult to process its natural food sources efficiently. This could have contributed to its willingness to target livestock and ultimately humans as easier prey options. For Rogers, the bear attack investigation became a defining experience of his law enforcement career. He had witnessed the raw power of nature and the tragic consequences that could result when human development encroached on wildlife habitat. The incident also reinforced his respect for the dedicated professionals at Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, who managed the delicate balance between conservation and public safety. In the months following the attack, Rogers became something of an expert on human-wildlife conflict issues within the Flathead County Sheriff's Office. He attended additional training programs on wildlife management and became the department's primary liaison with Fish and Wildlife for future bear-related calls. The Bear Creek area where Harold Stevenson was killed became the site of increased bear awareness efforts, with warning signs posted throughout the drainage and educational materials provided to all residents. The Cabin Development Association implemented new guidelines for food storage and waste management designed to reduce the likelihood of future bear encounters. Ted Walsh, the rancher whose livestock attacks had started Rogers' involvement in the case, installed electric fencing around his cattle operation and implemented other bear-proofing measures recommended by Fish and Wildlife. He never experienced another significant predator attack, though he occasionally found bear sign on his property during subsequent years. The Henderson Ranch, where Rogers had documented some of the most severe livestock damage, was eventually sold to new owners who were better prepared for the realities of ranching in bear country. Marcus and Linda Henderson moved to a smaller property closer to Kalispell, acknowledging that remote ranch living had been more challenging than they had anticipated. Rogers' experience with the fatal bear attack also influenced his personal life. He and his wife Janet had long discussions about the risks and responsibilities of living in grizzly bear habitat. They implemented bear-proofing measures around their own home and became more conscious of their behavior in the backcountry. The broader community response to Harold Stevenson's death included increased funding for bear awareness education programs and enhanced cooperation between law enforcement agencies and wildlife management professionals. The incident served as a tragic reminder that grizzly bear recovery, while a conservation success story, also brought new challenges and responsibilities. Dr. Elizabeth Martinez continued her work with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and remained in contact with Rogers about subsequent bear management issues in the Flathead Valley. She often cited the Bear Creek incident as an example of how quickly wildlife situations could escalate and the importance of immediate, coordinated response by multiple agencies. The story of the November 4th bear attack was eventually featured in several national publications and television programs about human-wildlife conflict. Rogers was interviewed for some of these stories, though he always emphasized the tragic loss of life and the complex challenges facing both bears and humans in shared habitat areas. As the years passed, Rogers continued to handle wildlife calls throughout Flathead County, though none matched the intensity and tragedy of the Bear Creek incident. He developed a reputation as one of the most knowledgeable law enforcement officers in the region regarding wildlife issues, and he frequently assisted with training programs for new deputies. The lessons learned from Harold Stevenson's death contributed to improved protocols for responding to problem bear situations throughout Montana. Law enforcement agencies, wildlife managers, and emergency responders developed better coordination procedures and enhanced training programs designed to protect both public safety and wildlife conservation interests. Rogers often reflected on the complex relationship between humans and grizzly bears in northwestern Montana. The bears were an integral part of the ecosystem, a symbol of the region's wild character, and a conservation success story that had brought the species back from the brink of extinction. However, they were also large, powerful predators capable of inflicting terrible harm when circumstances brought them into conflict with humans. The challenge, as Rogers had learned during his investigation of the Bear Creek attack, was finding ways for people and bears to coexist safely in shared habitat. This required constant vigilance, proper food storage and waste management, respect for wildlife, and the recognition that living in grizzly bear country carried both privileges and responsibilities. Harold Stevenson's death had been a tragedy, but it had also served as a powerful reminder of the importance of these efforts. The bear that killed him had been destroyed, but hundreds of other grizzly bears continued to roam the forests and mountains of northwestern Montana, playing their vital ecological role while occasionally reminding humans of their presence. For Rogers, the November 4th bear attack remained a defining moment that shaped his understanding of law enforcement in rural Montana. It was a reminder that police work in the rural West involved not just human criminals and traffic enforcement, but also the ancient and ongoing drama of human-wildlife interaction in one of the few places where large predators still ruled the landscape. The memory of Harold Stevenson, the massive grizzly bear, and the 2 minutes that changed everything would stay with Rogers for the rest of his career. It was a story of tragedy and loss, but also of professional dedication, community response, and the ongoing challenge of balancing human safety with wildlife conservation in the American West. The Bear Creek drainage where the attack occurred eventually returned to its natural quiet, disturbed only by the sounds of flowing water, wind through the trees, and the occasional passage of wildlife moving through their ancient travel corridors. But for those who had been touched by the events of November 4th and 5th, 2024, the memory of those 2 days would serve as a permanent reminder of the power, beauty, and danger of life in grizzly bear country. The next stories. Grizzly attacks family barbecue, kills uncle and dog. August 12th, 2025. The morning of August 12th, 2025, dawned crisp and clear in Kalispell, Montana, with the kind of pristine blue sky that made tourists fall in love with Big Sky country and convinced locals they lived in paradise. Sarah Elizabeth Martinez stood at her kitchen window, watching the early sunlight filter through the towering ponderosa pines that bordered her 3-acre property on the outskirts of town, steam rising from her coffee mug as she mentally prepared for what promised to be a perfect day for their annual family barbecue. At 34, Sarah was a registered nurse at Logan Health Medical Center, a pragmatic woman who had moved to Montana 5 years earlier from Phoenix with her husband David and their twin daughters. She chose this particular house not just for its rustic charm and the spectacular view of the Glacier National Park peaks in the distance, but for what she believed was its perfect balance of wilderness beauty and suburban safety. The 6-foot cedar fence surrounding their backyard had seemed more than adequate for keeping out the occasional deer or coyote, and the motion sensor lights David had installed after they'd moved in provided an additional sense of security. David Martinez, 36, worked as a software engineer for a company that allowed him to telecommute from their Montana home. Originally from Texas, he had embraced the outdoor lifestyle with the enthusiasm of a convert, spending his weekends hiking the countless trails that crisscrossed the Flathead Valley, learning to fly fish in the crystal-clear streams that descended from the Continental Divide, and teaching his daughters, Emma and Sophia, both 11, to appreciate the natural world that surrounded them. The barbecue had been planned for weeks. Sarah's brother, Michael Johnson, was driving up from Missoula with his teenage son, Trevor. Her parents were flying in from Denver, and David's sister, Carmen, would be bringing her family from Whitefish. It was the kind of multi-generational gathering that had become precious to Sarah since moving so far from extended family, and she had spent the previous week cleaning, shopping, and preparing her grandmother's secret recipe for potato salad. Michael Johnson, 48 years old, was a high school history teacher and football coach who had spent his entire adult life in Montana. Standing 6 feet 2 inches with prematurely gray hair and hands permanently stained from years of working on classic cars in his garage, he was the kind of man who commanded respect from teenagers and could fix almost anything mechanical. His wife, Rebecca, had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, leaving him to raise their son Trevor alone, a responsibility he had embraced with quiet determination despite his own grief. Trevor Johnson, 16, was a lanky kid who had inherited his father's height and his mother's dark eyes. Since his mother's death, he had become increasingly withdrawn, finding solace in video games and science fiction novels rather than the outdoor activities his father tried to encourage. The family barbecue represented one of the few social events he genuinely looked forward to, mainly because his cousins Emma and Sophia were among the few people who could draw him out of his shell. Robert and Helen Chen, Sarah's adoptive parents, had retired to Denver 2 years earlier after careers in banking and education, respectively. Both in their mid-60s, they maintained the kind of active lifestyle that their friends envied, traveling extensively and maintaining a garden that was featured in the local newspaper. They had adopted Sarah as an infant from Korea, raising her as their own daughter with a love and devotion that she had never questioned or taken for granted. Carmen Martinez Rodriguez, David's younger sister, was 33 and worked as a veterinarian in Whitefish. She would be bringing her husband Juan, a forest ranger, and their 2 children, 8-year-old Miguel and 6-year-old Isabella. Carmen had always been the athlete of the family, competing in marathons and spending her free time mountain biking the challenging trails around Whitefish Lake. Her professional experience with wildlife had made her cautious about bear safety, and she never went anywhere in Montana without bear spray. The weather forecast had been perfect. Sunny skies, temperatures in the mid-70s, with a gentle breeze from the northwest that would keep the mosquitoes at bay. Sarah had spent Saturday morning preparing the side dishes and marinades, while David cleaned the large gas grill he had bought specifically for occasions like this. The twins had been assigned the task of setting up the outdoor furniture and ensuring their golden retriever, Buddy, a 3-year-old purebred who had been with the family since he was a puppy, was bathed and ready to greet their guests. The property itself sat on what had historically been the migration route for various wildlife species moving between the Flathead Valley and the higher elevations of Glacier National Park. While most of the original forest had been cleared decades earlier for suburban development, the Martinez property backed up to a 50-acre parcel of undeveloped land that served as a wildlife corridor. Sarah and David had initially seen this as a selling point, imagining mornings when they might glimpse deer grazing in the early light or hear the haunting calls of loons on nearby ponds. What they hadn't fully comprehended was that this same corridor was regularly used by black bears and increasingly grizzly bears whose territories were expanding as populations recovered following decades of protection under the Endangered Species Act. The Montana Department of Fish Wildlife and Parks had documented increasing numbers of grizzly bear sightings in the Kalispell area over the previous 5 years, a trend that reflected both conservation success and growing human-wildlife conflict potential. By 10 o'clock that morning, Sarah had finished most of her preparation and was reviewing her mental checklist when her phone rang. Michael's voice came through clearly, though she could hear road noise in the background, indicating he was already on his way. "Sarah, it's Mike. Trevor and I are about an hour out. I wanted to check if you need us to pick up anything in town before we head to your place." "I think we're all set," Sarah replied, walking out onto the deck to check the outdoor serving area one more time. "David's got the grill ready, and I've got enough food to feed an army. How's Trevor doing?" "He's actually excited, which is saying something these days. He's been looking forward to seeing the girls and showing off his new camera. He's gotten really into photography lately." "That's wonderful, Mike. I'm so glad you're both coming. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Mom and Dad's flight gets in around noon, right?" "Right, and Carmen's family should be here around the same time. David went to pick up some ice and extra propane, but he'll be back soon." After ending the call, Sarah stepped out onto the deck that overlooked their backyard. The space was perfect for entertaining. A large wooden deck extended from the house, with steps leading down to a paved patio area surrounded by carefully maintained flower beds. David had built a fire pit surrounded by comfortable chairs about 30 feet from the house, and the large cottonwood trees that shaded most of the yard provided natural air conditioning even on the hottest summer days. The cedar fence that surrounded the property had been installed by the previous owners and appeared to be well maintained. At 6 feet high, with vertical boards and no significant gaps, it seemed more than adequate for privacy and security. The gate on the east side provided access to the undeveloped land beyond, though Sarah and David rarely used it except for occasional walks with Buddy. What Sarah didn't know, as she stood on her deck that morning admiring the peaceful scene and anticipating the day ahead, was that approximately 3 miles away, a large male grizzly bear was beginning to stir from his daybed in a dense thicket of serviceberry and mountain ash. The bear, later identified by wildlife officials as an 8-year-old, approximately 450 pounds, had been tracked by researchers who had designated him Bear greater than 394. Bear greater than 394 had been born in the remote backcountry of Glacier National Park, but had gradually expanded his territory as he matured, learning to exploit the rich food sources available in the interface between wilderness and human settlement. Unlike many bears that avoided human contact, greater than 394 had developed a troubling pattern of behavior that wildlife biologists call habituation. He had lost his natural fear of humans and had begun to associate human activity with easily accessible food sources. Over the previous 3 weeks, greater than 394 had raided garbage cans in 2 neighborhoods, destroyed a bird feeder, and had been spotted several times by residents who reported his presence to Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. Each incident had been investigated, but the bear's intelligence and unpredictable movement patterns had made him difficult to track and relocate. Wildlife officials had issued warnings to residents about securing attractants and being bear-aware, but no specific evacuation or closure orders had been issued. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a wildlife biologist with 15 years of experience studying grizzly bear behavior, had been assigned to investigate the increasing number of reports about bear greater than 394. At 42, she had dedicated her career to understanding the complex interactions between recovering grizzly bear populations and expanding human development in northwest Montana. Her research had documented how individual bears could adapt to human environments in ways that dramatically increased the potential for dangerous encounters. The problem with bears like greater than 394, Dr. Walsh would later explain to investigators, is that they're incredibly intelligent and adaptable. Once a bear learns that human environments provide easy access to high-calorie food sources, they begin to actively seek out these opportunities. They lose their natural wariness and begin to take risks that bring them into direct contact with people. At 11:15 that morning, as David Martinez returned from his trip to town and began unloading ice and propane from his SUV, Bear 394 was approximately 2 miles away, moving through the forest corridor that connected the wilderness areas to the south with the residential neighborhoods where the Martinez family lived. His movements were purposeful and directed, following scent trails that indicated the presence of food sources ahead. The bear's exceptional sense of smell, approximately 7 times more sensitive than that of a bloodhound, had detected the complex mixture of aromas associated with food preparation. The propane grill that David had tested earlier that morning, the marinades that Sarah had prepared, and the various other food odors that were beginning to emanate from the house as the day warmed up. David Martinez had grown up in San Antonio, where the most dangerous wildlife encounters involved the occasional rattlesnake or javelina. His 5 years in Montana had given him a healthy respect for the potential dangers of living in bear country, and he conscientiously followed all the recommended precautions, securing garbage in bear-proof containers, cleaning his grill after each use, and never leaving pet food outside. He had attended a bear safety presentation at his daughter's school and had even purchased bear spray, though he kept it in his truck rather than carrying it regularly. As he carried the bags of ice toward the house, David noticed Buddy behaving strangely. The usually friendly and outgoing golden retriever was standing rigid at the far end of the yard, his ears erect and his attention focused on something beyond the fence. A low growl rumbled from the dog's throat, something David had rarely heard in the 3 years they had owned him. "What is it, boy?" David called, setting down the ice and walking toward the dog. Buddy's behavior was uncharacteristic enough to cause David some concern, but as he approached the fence line, he heard nothing unusual and saw no obvious signs of what might be disturbing the animal. Unknown to David, Bear greater than 394 was at that moment less than a quarter-mile away, working his way through the dense undergrowth that bordered the residential area. The bear had encountered human scent and was proceeding with the kind of cautious curiosity that characterized his approach to potential food sources. His previous experiences with human environments had taught him that patience and stealth often yielded better results than direct confrontation. By 11:30, Carmen Martinez Rodriguez and her family had arrived from Whitefish. Juan Rodriguez, her husband, was a forest ranger with the U.S. Forest Service who had spent his entire career in northwest Montana. At 35, he possessed the kind of practical knowledge about wildlife behavior that came from years of field experience. As a ranger, he had responded to numerous bear encounters and had developed a deep respect for the power and unpredictability of both black bears and grizzlies. "Nice setup you've got here, David," Juan commented as he helped unload their family's contribution to the barbecue. "This is perfect weather for a cookout." "Thanks. We've been looking forward to this for weeks," David replied. "The girls are excited to see Miguel and Isabella." Carmen emerged from the house, where she had been greeting Sarah and surveying the food preparation. As a veterinarian, she had treated numerous domestic animals that had been injured in wildlife encounters, and she automatically assessed any new environment for potential risks. "Have you had any wildlife issues back here?" she asked, noting the proximity of the undeveloped land beyond the fence. "Not really," David answered. "We see deer occasionally, and there was a black bear in the neighborhood last spring, but nothing serious. We keep the garbage secured and clean the grill regularly. That's good. Juan says there have been more grizzly sightings around Kalispell lately. Just something to keep in mind. Juan nodded in agreement. The population is recovering, which is great for conservation, but it does mean more potential for encounters. Most bears avoid people, but this time of year they're building up fat reserves for hibernation, so they're more aggressive about food sources. This conversation was taking place at the precise moment when Bear, greater than 394, had reached the edge of the residential area and was beginning to move through the backyards of properties that bordered the wildlife corridor. His approach was methodical and careful, using natural cover to avoid detection while following the increasingly strong scent trail that indicated a significant food source ahead. At noon, Sarah's parents arrived via taxi from the airport. Robert Chen, at 64, was a retired bank manager who had maintained his health through regular golf and hiking. Helen Chen, 62, had been a high school principal for 30 years before retirement and possessed the kind of organizational skills that made family gatherings run smoothly. Their arrival brought the gathering to 9 people, plus the 4 children, creating the kind of multi-generational celebration that Sarah treasured. Michael and Trevor Johnson arrived 15 minutes later, completing the family group. Michael parked his pickup truck in the driveway and immediately began helping David set up the serving tables on the deck. Trevor, camera in hand, began documenting the gathering with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a new passion. "This is beautiful, Sarah," Helen commented, surveying the backyard setup. "You've created such a lovely space here." "Thanks, Mom. David did most of the landscaping. He's got quite the green thumb." The group had been together for approximately 30 minutes, with David beginning to preheat the grill and the children playing in the yard under Buddy's watchful supervision when the first subtle signs of trouble began to manifest. Buddy, who had been relatively calm since the arrival of the guests, once again began displaying signs of agitation. The dog's behavior was noticed first by Trevor, who was photographing the children at play. "Uncle David, is Buddy okay? He seems really nervous about something." David looked over at the dog, who was once again staring intently at the fence line, his body tense and alert. This time, however, David could also hear what appeared to be movement in the brush beyond the property. "Probably just deer," he said, though he was beginning to feel a vague sense of unease. "There's a lot of wildlife back there." Carmen, however, had noticed Buddy's behavior and was approaching the fence line to investigate. Her professional experience with animal behavior had taught her to take seriously the warning signs displayed by domestic animals, particularly dogs, whose senses were far superior to those of humans. "Juan, come take a look at this," she called to her husband. Juan Rodriguez approached the fence and immediately noticed what David had missed: several broken branches in the undergrowth beyond the property at a height that suggested something large had recently passed through the area. More concerning was a distinct musky odor that he recognized from his years of field work. "David, I think we need to get everyone inside right now," Juan said, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately got everyone's attention. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, noting the sudden change in Juan's demeanor. "I think there might be a bear in the area. The dog's behavior and some signs I'm seeing suggest we should move this inside for now." At that moment, as if summoned by Juan's words, Bear, greater than 394, emerged from the tree line approximately 50 yards away, on the far side of the undeveloped land that bordered the Martinez property. Even at that distance, the bear's massive size was immediately apparent to everyone present. Standing on his hind legs to get a better view of the activity in the backyard, the grizzly appeared enormous against the backdrop of pine trees. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, instinctively moving toward her daughters, who had stopped playing and were staring at the bear with a mixture of fascination and fear. "Everyone move slowly toward the house," Juan instructed, his voice calm but authoritative. "Don't run, don't make sudden movements. but we need to get inside now." The bear, approximately 150 yards away, dropped back to all fours and began moving in their direction. His gait was purposeful and unhurried, the kind of confident approach that experienced wildlife officers recognized as potentially dangerous. This was not a bear that was afraid of humans or uncertain about his intentions. Michael Johnson, despite having lived in Montana his entire adult life, had never seen a grizzly bear outside of Glacier National Park. The sight of the massive animal approaching their family gathering triggered an immediate flood of adrenaline and an almost overwhelming urge to flee. However, his instincts as a father and his natural protective instincts toward his family overrode his personal fear. "Trevor, come here, right now," he called to his son, who had raised his camera and was attempting to photograph the approaching bear. "Dad, this is incredible. I've never seen a grizzly this close. Trevor, put the camera down and move toward the house now." The next few minutes would be reconstructed later by investigators based on the testimony of the 9 adult witnesses and the photographic evidence captured by Trevor's camera. The bear's approach was methodical and persistent, suggesting that he was not merely passing through the area but was specifically attracted to the food odors and human activity in the backyard. As the family group began moving toward the house, maintaining the slow, non-threatening pace that Juan had instructed, the bear reached the fence line on the far side of the property. At this point, he was approximately 75 yards from the closest family members, but was clearly focused on the activity in the backyard rather than moving through the area. "Is the fence going to stop him?" Robert asked, his voice betraying the tension that everyone was feeling. "A 6-foot fence won't stop a grizzly if he wants to get over it," Juan replied grimly. "They're incredibly strong and surprisingly agile." Bear greater than 394 began moving along the fence line, apparently looking for the easiest point of entry. His behavior demonstrated the intelligence that made him particularly dangerous. Rather than attempting to go through or over the fence immediately, he was assessing his options and looking for the path of least resistance. The bear's movement brought him to the gate on the east side of the property, the same gate that Sarah and David occasionally used for access to the undeveloped land beyond. The gate was secured with a simple latch mechanism that had been adequate for keeping the family dog in the yard, but was never intended to keep large wildlife out. "The gate," David said, recognizing immediately that this represented the bear's most likely point of entry. "We need to get inside right now." However, as the family group reached the deck and began moving toward the sliding glass door that led into the house, Bear 394 demonstrated why grizzly bears are considered one of North America's most formidable predators. Rather than bothering with the gate, he simply reared up on his hind legs and placed his massive paws on top of the 6-foot fence. For a moment the bear remained in this position, as if assessing the situation in the backyard. From this elevated position, he had a clear view of the 9 adults and 4 children who were hurrying toward the house, as well as Buddy, who was barking frantically while staying close to the family group. Then, with a display of strength and agility that seemed impossible for an animal of his size, Bear greater than 394 simply climbed over the fence and dropped into the Martinez backyard. The sight of the massive grizzly landing heavily in their yard, less than 40 yards away, triggered an immediate panic response in several family members. Helen Chen screamed and stumbled, nearly falling as she attempted to reach the house. The children, who had been maintaining the calm pace that Juan had instructed, now began to cry and run toward their parents. "Move! Move! Move!" Juan shouted, abandoning any attempt to maintain the slow, non-threatening approach that was recommended for bear encounters. The bear's decision to enter the yard had fundamentally changed the dynamics of the situation. Bear greater than 394, now inside the fenced yard, began moving directly toward the area where the grill was set up and where the food preparation had been taking place. His focus seemed to be on the food sources rather than the people, but his size and proximity made him an immediate threat to everyone present. David Martinez, who'd been helping his father-in-law Robert reach the house, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of continuing toward safety, he turned back toward the grill, apparently intending to shut off the propane and remove the food that was attracting the bear. "David, no!" Sarah screamed as she realized what her husband was attempting to do. Michael Johnson, seeing his brother-in-law moving toward the bear rather than away from it, made an instantaneous decision that reflected his character and his protective instincts. Despite having no experience with dangerous wildlife encounters and no training in bear safety, he moved to intercept David and redirect him toward the house. "Leave it! Just leave everything and get inside," Michael shouted, grabbing David's arm and attempting to pull him toward safety. This intervention likely saved David's life, but put Michael in the most dangerous possible position. He was now the closest person to bear greater than 394, who had reached the grill area and was investigating the food sources with single-minded determination. The bear's investigation of the grill and food preparation area was methodical and destructive. Using his massive claws, he overturned the serving table, scattering dishes and food across the patio. His powerful jaws crushed a cooler filled with beverages, sending glass and liquid flying. The sight and sound of the destruction was terrifying to the family members who were still trying to reach safety. At this point, Buddy made a decision that reflected the protective instincts of his breed and his devotion to the Martinez family. The 3-year-old golden retriever, who weighed approximately 70 pounds, launched himself at the 450-pound grizzly bear in an attempt to drive the predator away from his family. The dog's attack was brave but hopeless. Bear greater than 394, startled by the sudden assault, turned on Buddy with devastating effectiveness. A single swipe of the bear's paw, armed with claws that were over 3 inches long, struck the dog with sufficient force to break multiple ribs and cause massive internal injuries. Buddy's yelp of pain and the sight of their beloved pet being mauled by the bear created a moment of pure horror for everyone present. Several family members screamed, and Trevor Johnson, despite the danger, continued to document the attack with his camera, capturing images that would later be crucial evidence in the investigation. The dog's attack had served one crucial purpose. It had distracted the bear from his investigation of the food sources and had focused his attention on the immediate threats around him. Unfortunately, this meant that Bear, greater than 394, now became aware of the human beings who were still trying to reach safety. Michael Johnson, who had been attempting to help David reach the house, was now approximately 25 feet from the bear and directly in the animal's line of sight. The bear, having dispatched the dog, now focused his attention on Michael with the kind of predatory intensity that wildlife experts recognize as an immediate precursor to attack. "Run, Michael, run!" Juan shouted from the deck, where he had reached safety with his own family and was desperately searching his pockets for the bear spray that he always carried when in the wilderness. Michael Johnson had perhaps 3 seconds to react as Bear greater than 394 began charging toward him. A grizzly bear can reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour, making them faster than any human being over short distances. Michael's only chance of survival lay in reaching the house before the bear could cover the 25 feet that separated them. He didn't make it. Bear greater than 394 reached Michael in less than 2 seconds, striking him with a force that knocked him to the ground immediately. The initial impact alone was devastating. The bear's paw, weighing approximately 15 pounds and armed with claws designed for digging and fighting, struck Michael in the back and shoulder area with enough force to break multiple bones. Michael's scream of pain and terror galvanized the family members who had reached safety on the deck. Sarah began sobbing uncontrollably, while David attempted to re-enter the yard to help his brother-in-law. Juan Rodriguez physically restrained him, recognizing that any attempt at rescue would likely result in additional casualties. The bear's attack on Michael was brief, but devastating. Grizzly bears are capable of delivering bite forces of up to 1,200 pounds per square inch, and their massive size allows them to inflict catastrophic injuries through simple physical trauma. Bear greater than 394's assault on Michael lasted approximately 15 seconds, but resulted in injuries that were immediately life-threatening. Trevor Johnson, who had been the last family member to reach the deck, had witnessed his father's attack from a distance of perhaps 30 feet. The 16-year-old's psychological trauma would require years of therapy, but in the moment, his response was to continue photographing the attack, as if the camera could somehow provide a barrier between him and the horror unfolding in front of him. "Someone call 911, Carmen screamed, though she was already pulling her cell phone from her pocket and dialing emergency services. The attack on Michael concluded when Bear greater than 394 apparently determined that the threat had been neutralized. The bear then returned his attention to the food sources that had originally attracted him to the property, leaving Michael motionless on the patio, approximately 15 feet from the overturned grill. The next several minutes represented a nightmarish waiting period for the family members who had reached safety. Michael was clearly alive but seriously injured, occasionally moving and making sounds that indicated he was conscious but in severe pain. However, the bear remained in the yard, methodically consuming the food that had been scattered during his destruction of the serving area. Juan Rodriguez had finally located his bear spray and was attempting to determine whether he could use it effectively from his position on the deck. However, the wind direction and the distance involved made it unlikely that the spray would be effective, and any missed attempt might provoke another attack. 911. What's your emergency? The operator's voice came through Carmen's phone clearly, providing the first connection to outside help. This is Carmen Martinez Rodriguez. I'm a veterinarian. We have a grizzly bear attack in progress at 1247 Pine Ridge Road in Kalispell. We have one person down with serious injuries, and the bear is still in the yard. We need immediate emergency response. Ma'am, did you say a grizzly bear attack? Yes, a large male grizzly. He's attacked a 48-year-old male and killed a dog. The victim is alive but seriously injured, and we can't reach him because the bear is still present. How many people are at your location? 13 total, including 4 children. 12 of us are safe inside the house, but one man is injured in the yard, and we can't get to him. The 911 operator immediately began dispatching multiple emergency response units. In Montana, grizzly bear attacks triggered a coordinated response involving local law enforcement, emergency medical services, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks officers, and specialized wildlife response teams. Sheriff's Deputy Marcus Williams was the first emergency responder to receive the dispatch call. A 10-year veteran of the Flathead County Sheriff's Office, Williams had responded to numerous wildlife encounters but had never dealt with an active bear attack situation. His initial response was to request backup and to begin coordinating with the other agencies that would be needed. Dispatch, this is Deputy Williams. I'm responding to the bear attack on Pine Ridge Road. What's the current status? Deputy Williams, we have multiple callers reporting a grizzly bear attack at 1247 Pine Ridge Road. One adult male victim with serious injuries, bear still on scene. 12 other people trapped in the residence. Understood. I'm requesting backup, FWP response, and EMS. Estimated arrival time 8 minutes. The 8 minutes between the emergency call and the arrival of the first responders represented an eternity for the Martinez family and their guests. Michael Johnson remained motionless on the patio, occasionally making sounds that indicated he was still alive, but clearly in desperate need of medical attention. Bear greater than 394 continued his methodical consumption of the food sources in the yard, apparently oblivious to the human tragedy he had caused. His behavior suggested that he viewed the attack on Michael as simply removing a threat to his access to food, rather than as predatory behavior directed toward humans as prey. Sarah Martinez had gone into emotional shock, alternating between sobbing uncontrollably and staring in silent horror at her injured brother. David was attempting to comfort his wife while simultaneously looking for any opportunity to help Michael. The children had been moved to the far side of the house, where they couldn't see what was happening in the yard, but their parents' distress had clearly communicated to them that something terrible was occurring. Juan Rodriguez remained the de facto leader of the group during this crisis period, using his professional experience to assess the situation and communicate with emergency responders. His knowledge of bear behavior allowed him to predict that the bear would likely leave the area once he had finished with the available food sources, but he couldn't predict when that might occur or whether the bear might decide to investigate the house itself. At 12:47 p.m., exactly 17 minutes after bear greater than 394 had first been spotted in the distance, Deputy Williams arrived at the Pine Ridge Road address. His first priority was to assess the situation and establish a safe perimeter around the property. However, the ongoing presence of the bear in the backyard complicated any rescue attempt. Williams parked his patrol car at a safe distance from the house and used his radio to communicate with the family inside. Juan Rodriguez had provided his cell phone number to the 911 operator, allowing for direct communication between the trapped family and the responding officers. "This is Deputy Williams with the Flathead County Sheriff's Office. I'm on scene at your location. Can you give me an update on the current situation?" "The bear is still in the backyard, feeding on the scattered food," Juan reported. "The victim is approximately 15 feet from the house, still breathing but unconscious. We haven't been able to reach him. I need you to stay inside until we can neutralize the bear threat. We have wildlife officers en route, and EMS is standing by." The Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Response Team, led by wildlife biologist Dr. Jennifer Walsh, arrived on scene at 12:52 p.m. Dr. Walsh's team included 2 armed wildlife officers trained in dangerous animal response and equipped with both tranquilizer equipment and high-powered rifles capable of stopping a charging grizzly bear. "The priority is human safety first," Dr. Walsh explained to Deputy Williams as they assessed the situation from a position of cover near the street. "If we can tranquilize the bear and relocate him, that's preferable, but if he poses an immediate threat to human life, we're prepared to use lethal force." The decision-making process was complicated by several factors. Michael Johnson was clearly in need of immediate medical attention, but any attempt to enter the yard while the bear was present would likely trigger another attack. The bear's behavior suggested that he was focused on food rather than viewing humans as prey, but grizzly bears are notoriously unpredictable, and the situation could change instantly. Dr. Walsh's assessment of bear greater than 394's behavior confirmed her worst fears about his level of habituation to human environments. "This bear has clearly lost his natural fear of humans," she explained to the other responders. "His willingness to climb the fence and remain in the yard, despite all the human activity, suggests that he's had positive associations with human food sources in the past." The tranquilizer option was considered, but ultimately rejected due to the time required for the drugs to take effect and the potential for the tranquilizer to make the bear more unpredictable during the initial phase of sedation. With Michael's life hanging in the balance, the response team made the difficult decision to use lethal force. Wildlife Officer Mark Patterson, a veteran of 15 years with Montana FWP and an experienced marksman, was selected to take the shot. Using a .30-06 rifle loaded with high-power ammunition designed specifically for dangerous game, Patterson positioned himself at a location that provided a clear line of sight to the bear while minimizing the risk to the trapped family members. At 1:03 p.m., as bear greater than 394 lifted his head from feeding and looked in the direction of the house, Officer Patterson took the shot that ended the 16-minute ordeal. The large-caliber bullet struck the bear in the head, causing immediate death and ending the threat to human life. The silence that followed the gunshot was profound and eerie after the tension of the previous 17 minutes. Bear greater than 394 collapsed where he had been feeding, his massive body finally motionless among the scattered remnants of what should have been a joyful family gathering. "Bear is down! Bear is down!" Deputy Williams radioed to the emergency medical team that had been standing by. "EMS can approach the victim." The paramedics who responded to the scene included lead paramedic Sandra Hayes, a veteran of 12 years with American Medical Response, who had extensive experience with trauma cases but had never treated a bear attack victim. Her partner, EMT Jake Morrison, was newer to the service but had trained specifically in wilderness emergency medicine. Their initial assessment of Michael Johnson's injuries was grim. He had suffered multiple lacerations to his back, shoulders, and head, along with what appeared to be several broken ribs and possible internal injuries. His breathing was labored, and he had lost a significant amount of blood during the 17 minutes he had lain in the yard. "We've got a male, approximately 48 years old, multiple trauma from bear attack," Hayes radioed to Logan Health Medical Center as she began emergency treatment. "Multiple lacerations, possible internal injuries, significant blood loss. Patient is semi-conscious and responsive to pain stimulus." The medical team's work was complicated by the need to stabilize Michael in the backyard where the attack had occurred. Moving him immediately was not an option due to the severity of his injuries, so Hayes and Morrison began advanced life support procedures on the patio where he had fallen. 4 fluids were started to address blood loss, oxygen was administered to support his labored breathing, and his wounds were covered with trauma dressings to control bleeding. The most serious concern was possible internal bleeding from the massive trauma he had sustained during the bear's attack. While the medical team worked to stabilize Michael, the family members who had witnessed the attack began to emerge from the house. The children were kept away from the scene, but the adults gathered on the deck to watch the rescue efforts and to begin processing what they had experienced. Trevor Johnson, who had remained remarkably composed during the attack itself, now began to show signs of severe emotional trauma. The 16-year-old who had been documenting the attack with his camera was now shaking uncontrollably and appeared to be in shock. "Trevor, come here, son," his grandfather Robert said, attempting to provide comfort to the teenager who had just watched his father being mauled by a grizzly bear. "I got it all on camera, Grandpa," Trevor said, his voice hollow and distant. "I got pictures of everything." Sarah Martinez, who had been Michael's primary emotional support since his wife's death 3 years earlier, was inconsolable. The sight of her brother lying bloodied on the patio while paramedics worked to save his life was overwhelming, and she required medical attention herself for the severe emotional trauma she was experiencing. The emergency medical team's assessment concluded that Michael's injuries were severe enough to require immediate transport to a trauma center. Logan Health Medical Center in Kalispell was equipped to handle serious trauma cases, but the nature of Michael's injuries raised the possibility that he might need to be airlifted to a larger facility in Missoula or even Seattle. At 1:21 p.m., 18 minutes after the bear had been shot, Michael Johnson was loaded into an ambulance for transport to Logan Health Medical Center. His vital signs had stabilized somewhat during the emergency treatment, but his condition remained critical. The emergency room team at Logan Health Medical Center had been alerted to expect a bear attack victim and had prepared for the kinds of injuries typically associated with such encounters. Dr. Patricia Romano, the emergency medicine physician on duty, had treated numerous trauma cases during her 8 years at the hospital, but had never dealt with a bear attack. What we typically see with bear attacks is a combination of severe lacerations from the claws, crushing injuries from the bite force, and significant soft tissue trauma, Dr. Romano explained to the nursing staff as they prepared for Michael's arrival. The primary concerns are blood loss, infection from the massive contamination of the wounds, and potential damage to vital organs. The initial medical assessment confirmed the paramedics' field diagnosis. Michael had suffered multiple deep lacerations across his back and shoulders, 3 broken ribs on his left side, and a possible concussion from the initial impact when the bear had knocked him down. Most concerning was evidence of internal bleeding that would require immediate surgical intervention. Dr. Romano's team worked for nearly 2 hours to stabilize Michael's condition and prepare him for surgery. The lacerations were cleaned and sutured, the broken ribs were stabilized, and imaging studies were performed to assess the extent of internal injuries. The surgical procedure, performed by Dr. Michael Stevens, a general surgeon with extensive trauma experience, lasted 4 hours and addressed multiple internal injuries, including a lacerated spleen and damage to several blood vessels. The surgery was successful in stopping the internal bleeding, but Michael's recovery would be lengthy and uncertain. While Michael was in surgery, the investigation into the bear attack began in earnest. Dr. Jennifer Walsh and her team needed to determine how and why bear greater than 394 had become so habituated to human environments and whether there were other bears in the area that might pose similar threats. The investigation revealed that bear greater than 394 had been reported in residential areas at least 6 times over the previous 3 weeks, with incidents ranging from garbage raids to the destruction of bird feeders. Each incident had been investigated by Montana FWP, but the bear's intelligence and mobility had made him difficult to track and relocate. "What we're seeing is a pattern of escalating boldness," Dr. Walsh explained to the media during a press conference held the day after the attack. This bear had clearly lost his natural fear of humans and had learned to associate human activity with easily accessible food sources. The necropsy performed on bear greater than 394 revealed that the animal was in excellent physical condition, weighing 453 pounds and showing no signs of injury or disease that might have affected his behavior. His stomach contents included garbage from multiple sources, confirming that he had been actively seeking out human-related food sources. The family members who had witnessed the attack required extensive psychological counseling to deal with the trauma they had experienced. Trevor Johnson, who had documented the attack with his camera, developed severe post-traumatic stress disorder and required intensive therapy. The photographic evidence that Trevor had captured during the attack proved to be crucial for both the investigation and for helping other family members process what had occurred. The images showed the bear's behavior throughout the incident and provided wildlife officials with valuable information about grizzly bear behavior in residential settings. Michael Johnson remained in the hospital for 3 weeks following the attack, undergoing multiple surgical procedures to address his injuries and infections that developed in several of his wounds. His physical recovery was complicated by the psychological trauma of the attack, and he required extensive rehabilitation both physically and emotionally. The investigation concluded that the attack could have been prevented if bear greater than 394 had been successfully located and relocated during the previous 3 weeks when he had been reported in residential areas. However, the bear's intelligence and unpredictable movement patterns had made him extremely difficult to track. Changes to wildlife management protocols were implemented following the attack, including more aggressive response to reports of bears in residential areas and enhanced public education about bear safety. The incident highlighted the challenges of managing recovering grizzly bear populations in areas where human development had expanded into traditional wildlife habitat. The Martinez family ultimately decided to sell their home and move to a different area, feeling that they could never feel safe in the location where the attack had occurred. The property sat empty for several months before being purchased by a buyer who installed additional security features, including motion-activated lighting and reinforced fencing. The undeveloped land behind the Martinez property was eventually purchased by the county and converted into a public park with enhanced wildlife management protocols. The wildlife corridor that had provided bear greater than 394 with access to residential areas was modified to include barriers designed to prevent large predators from moving into neighborhoods. Dr. Walsh's research following the attack contributed to a better understanding of how individual bears can adapt to human environments in ways that dramatically increase the risk of dangerous encounters. Her work emphasized the importance of preventing habituation through consistent and aggressive management of food sources and bear attractants in residential areas. The medical treatment that saved Michael Johnson's life became a case study in trauma medicine, particularly in the management of injuries caused by large predator attacks. The techniques used by Dr. Romano and her team were documented and shared with other medical facilities in bear country to improve treatment protocols for similar incidents. Trevor Johnson's photographic documentation of the attack was ultimately used in educational programs designed to help people understand the reality of bear encounters and the importance of bear safety precautions. Despite the traumatic nature of the images, wildlife officials determined that they provided valuable educational content that could help prevent future incidents. The broader implications of the attack extended beyond the immediate tragedy experienced by the Johnson and Martinez families. The incident occurred during a period of increasing human-wildlife conflict throughout the American West, as recovering predator populations encountered expanding human development in traditional wildlife habitats. Wildlife biologists emphasized that the attack represented an extreme outcome of the complex challenges associated with living in bear country. While such incidents are statistically rare, they highlight the importance of maintaining awareness and taking appropriate precautions when living or recreating in areas where large predators are present. The recovery of grizzly bear populations in the northern Rocky Mountains represents one of the great conservation success stories of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. However, as populations have recovered and expanded their ranges, the potential for human-wildlife conflict has increased significantly. The Martinez family barbecue attack became a symbol of the challenges and risks associated with this conservation success. While most people support the recovery of grizzly bear populations, the reality of living with large predators requires constant vigilance and respect for the power and unpredictability of wild animals. The incident also highlighted the importance of emergency preparedness and coordinated response protocols for wildlife emergencies. The successful rescue of Michael Johnson was the result of effective communication and coordination between multiple agencies, demonstrating the value of training and preparation for such emergencies. In the aftermath of the attack, community education programs were expanded throughout northwestern Montana to help residents understand the risks and responsibilities of living in bear country. These programs emphasize the importance of securing food sources, maintaining clean outdoor spaces, and knowing how to respond appropriately to bear encounters. The psychological impact of the attack extended beyond the immediate family members who witnessed it. The broader community struggled with the balance between supporting wildlife conservation and ensuring public safety. Some residents called for more aggressive management of bear populations, while others emphasized the importance of better education and prevention strategies. Michael Johnson's recovery was slow and difficult, requiring months of physical therapy and psychological counseling. The physical scars from the attack healed, but the emotional trauma required years of treatment. He eventually returned to teaching, but never fully recovered from the psychological impact of the encounter. The attack occurred at a time when bear populations were expanding their ranges and becoming more comfortable in human environments throughout the region. Wildlife officials documented increasing numbers of bear sightings in residential areas, reflecting both population recovery and the challenges of habituation to human food sources. The investigation revealed that bear greater than 394 had likely been surviving primarily on human-related food sources for several weeks before the attack, including garbage, pet food, and bird feeders. This pattern of behavior had made him increasingly bold and comfortable around human activity, setting the stage for the tragic encounter. The Martinez family's decision to move away from the area reflected the profound psychological impact of the attack on all family members. Sarah, in particular, never recovered from the trauma of watching her brother being mauled and required intensive therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. David Martinez struggled with guilt over his decision to return to the grill area during the initial encounter, believing that his actions had contributed to placing Michael in danger, while family members and counselors emphasized that his actions were understandable under the circumstances. He carried this burden for years following the attack. The children who witnessed the attack, particularly Emma and Sophia Martinez, required extensive counseling to process what they had experienced. The twins, who were 11 years old at the time of the attack, developed severe anxiety about outdoor activities and required years of therapy to overcome their fears. Carmen Rodriguez Martinez's professional experience as a veterinarian provided her with some understanding of animal behavior that helped her process the incident, but she still struggled with the randomness and violence of the encounter. Her husband Juan's experience as a forest ranger made him acutely aware of how quickly such situations could develop and how difficult they were to predict or prevent. The community response to the attack was complex and sometimes divisive. While most residents supported the family and recognized the tragedy of the situation, there were debates about wildlife management policies and the appropriateness of residential development in areas with high wildlife populations. Some residents argued that the attack demonstrated the need for more aggressive bear management, including expanded hunting seasons and more liberal use of lethal control measures. Others emphasized the importance of education and prevention, arguing that the attack could have been prevented through better management of attractants and more effective public awareness programs. The media coverage of the attack was extensive, with news outlets from across the region covering the story and its implications for wildlife management policy. The dramatic nature of the incident and the availability of photographic documentation made it a compelling news story that attracted national attention. However, some family members felt that the media coverage was intrusive and sensationalistic, focusing more on the dramatic aspects of the attack than on the broader issues of wildlife management and public safety. Trevor Johnson, in particular, struggled with the attention his photographs received and the way they were used by various media outlets. The legal implications of the attack were relatively straightforward, as Montana law provides broad protection for property owners defending themselves against wildlife threats. No charges were filed against any of the family members. and the decision to use lethal force against the bear was supported by state wildlife officials. However, the incident did raise questions about liability and responsibility for wildlife management. Some legal experts argued that government agencies had a responsibility to more aggressively manage problem bears before they became dangerous to humans, while others emphasized the challenges of predicting and preventing such incidents. The attack also highlighted issues related to residential development in wildlife habitats. While the Martinez property was not located in an area with specific wildlife protection designations, it was situated in habitat that was regularly used by bears and other large wildlife species. Urban planners and wildlife biologists began to examine more carefully the implications of residential development in areas with high wildlife populations, leading to enhanced requirements for wildlife-resistant construction and landscaping in some jurisdictions. The recovery and rehabilitation process for the Johnson and Martinez families continued for years following the attack. Michael Johnson required multiple surgeries to address complications from his injuries, including infections and problems with wound healing that are common with wildlife attack injuries. His teaching career was permanently affected by the attack, as he struggled with anxiety and depression that made it difficult for him to maintain his previous level of engagement with students and colleagues. While he eventually returned to the classroom, his effectiveness as a teacher was compromised by the psychological trauma he had experienced. Trevor Johnson's recovery was particularly challenging, as he struggled with survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress disorder. The teenager, who had been passionate about photography, found that he could no longer use a camera without experiencing flashbacks to the attack. His academic performance suffered significantly in the aftermath of the incident, and he required extensive support to complete high school. The college plans he had made before the attack were abandoned as he focused on his psychological recovery. The broader family dynamics were permanently altered by the shared trauma of the attack. Relationships that had been close and supportive became strained by the different ways family members processed and coped with what they had experienced. Some family members wanted to discuss the incident extensively as part of their healing process, while others preferred to avoid any mention of the attack. These different coping mechanisms created tensions and misunderstandings that persisted for years. The annual family barbecue that had brought everyone together on August 12, 2025, was never held again. The tradition that had represented family unity and celebration became too painful to continue, and the extended family found other ways to maintain their connections. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's research following the attack contributed significantly to the scientific understanding of grizzly bear behavior in residential settings. Her analysis of bear greater than 394's pattern of habituation became a model for predicting and preventing similar incidents. Her work emphasized the importance of early intervention when bears begin to show signs of habituation to human environments. The research demonstrated that once bears lose their natural fear of humans and begin to associate human activity with food sources, the risk of dangerous encounters increases exponentially. The study also highlighted the role of individual bear personality and intelligence in determining the likelihood of human-wildlife conflict. Bear greater than 394's exceptional intelligence and adaptability had made him particularly dangerous because he was able to learn and exploit human environmental patterns more effectively than typical bears. The findings were incorporated into wildlife management protocols throughout the northern Rocky Mountains, leading to more aggressive intervention strategies when bears are reported in residential areas. The goal became preventing habituation rather than simply responding to it after it had already occurred. The attack also contributed to advances in emergency medical treatment for large predator injuries. Dr. Romano's team documented their treatment protocols and shared them with other medical facilities in areas with large predator populations. The case study that resulted from Michael Johnson's treatment became part of the curriculum at emergency medicine training programs, helping to prepare medical professionals for the unique challenges associated with bear attack injuries. The surgical techniques used by Dr. Stevens to address Michael's internal injuries were also documented and shared with trauma surgeons throughout the region. The complex nature of injuries caused by large predator attacks required specialized knowledge and techniques that were not commonly encountered in most medical settings. The psychological treatment protocols developed for the Johnson and Martinez families were also shared with mental health professionals throughout Bear Country. The specific nature of trauma associated with wildlife attacks required specialized therapeutic approaches that differed from those used for other types of traumatic events. The long-term community impact of the attack continued to influence wildlife management and residential development policies in the Kalispell area for years afterward. The incident became a reference point for discussions about the appropriate balance between wildlife conservation and public safety. Property values in the immediate area were affected by the attack, with some potential buyers expressing concerns about wildlife safety when considering homes in the vicinity. Real estate agents found themselves needing to address wildlife risk as part of their discussions with prospective buyers. The attack also influenced local government policies regarding bear attractant management. Ordinances requiring bear-resistant garbage containers and prohibiting bird feeders during certain seasons were strengthened and more strictly enforced following the incident. Educational programs in local schools were expanded to include more comprehensive information about bear safety and wildlife awareness. The goal was to ensure that children growing up in Bear Country understood both the importance of wildlife conservation and the realities of living safely with large predators. The anniversary of the attack became an annual reminder for the community of the importance of bear safety and wildlife awareness. Local media outlets typically marked the date with updates on bear activity and reminders about proper precautions for residents. The Martinez property, which remained empty for several months following the attack, eventually sold to buyers who were specifically interested in implementing enhanced wildlife safety measures. The new owners installed motion-activated lighting, reinforced fencing, and other security features designed to deter wildlife encounters. The undeveloped land behind the property was ultimately purchased by Flathead County and converted into a public park with enhanced wildlife management protocols. The park included educational displays about wildlife safety and the importance of preventing human-wildlife conflict. The wildlife corridor that had provided bear greater than 394 with access to residential areas was modified through habitat management techniques designed to encourage wildlife movement away from residential areas while still maintaining connectivity for wildlife populations. These landscape-level modifications represented a new approach to managing human-wildlife conflict through environmental design rather than simply responding to problems after they occurred. The techniques developed in response to the Martinez attack were later applied in other areas facing similar challenges. The long-term impact of the attack on bear management policy extended throughout Montana and other areas with recovering grizzly bear populations. The incident became a case study in the challenges and risks associated with wildlife recovery in areas with significant human development. Wildlife officials used the lessons learned from the attack to refine their approaches to problem bear management, emphasizing the importance of early intervention and public education. The goal became preventing the development of problem behaviors rather than simply responding to them after they had already become dangerous. The incident also influenced research into bear behavior and ecology, with scientists working to better understand the factors that contribute to habituation and human-wildlife conflict. This research was crucial for developing more effective prevention strategies and management techniques. The Martinez family barbecue attack of August 12, 2025, ultimately became more than just a tragic incident affecting one extended family. It became a symbol of the challenges and responsibilities associated with wildlife conservation in the modern world, highlighting both the successes and the risks of efforts to restore large predator populations. The attack demonstrated that wildlife conservation success brings with it new challenges and responsibilities that require ongoing attention and adaptation. The recovery of grizzly bear populations represents a conservation triumph, but it also requires continued vigilance and education to ensure that humans and wildlife can coexist safely. The lessons learned from this tragic incident continue to influence wildlife management policies and practices throughout bear country, serving as a reminder of the importance of respecting wildlife while working to prevent dangerous encounters. The Martinez family's loss became the foundation for improved safety measures and management practices that help protect both humans and wildlife throughout the region. The story of that August afternoon in Kalispell serves as a sobering reminder that while we can work to minimize the risks of living in wildlife habitat, we cannot eliminate them entirely. The price of conservation success includes accepting the reality that wild animals remain wild, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous, requiring constant respect and vigilance from those who choose to share their landscape. In the end, the attack on the Martinez family barbecue became a catalyst for positive changes in wildlife management, emergency response protocols, medical treatment techniques, and community education programs. While the immediate tragedy cannot be undone, the lessons learned from that day continue to help protect other families and communities throughout bear country, ensuring that Michael Johnson's suffering and his family's trauma contribute to a safer coexistence between humans and the magnificent but potentially dangerous wildlife with which we share the landscape. The legacy of August 12, 2025 serves as both a warning and an inspiration. A warning about the real risks of living in wildlife habitat, and an inspiration for the continued efforts to develop better ways of sharing our world with the wild animals that make it so remarkable and so dangerous. The grizzly bear that destroyed one family's peaceful afternoon also opened the door to improved safety, better understanding, and more effective conservation practices that benefit both humans and wildlife throughout the northern Rocky Mountains. The next stories. Grizzly bear mauls 3 camp counselors in 7 minutes, June 14, 2024. The morning mist clung to Flathead Lake like a shroud as Rebecca Ann Lane adjusted her rearview mirror and caught her reflection staring back. 24 years old, auburn hair pulled into a practical ponytail, green eyes bright with the kind of optimism that comes from believing the summer ahead holds nothing but adventure. She had no way of knowing that in exactly 72 hours and 14 minutes, those same green eyes would be staring sightlessly at the rough-hewn ceiling of Cabin 7, while a 600-pound grizzly bear named Bear 211 by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks researchers tore through her abdomen with claws that measured 4 inches from base to tip. Rebecca's 2019 Honda Civic wound through the Serpentine Mountain Road, leading to Camp Timber, located 12 miles northeast of Kalispell, Montana, in the heart of grizzly country. The Subaru Outback behind her belonged to Tyler James Scott, 26, whose nervous energy had him drumming his fingers against the steering wheel to the rhythm of the classic rock station bleeding through his speakers. Tyler had grown up in suburban Denver, where the most dangerous wildlife he'd encountered was the occasional coyote raiding trash cans. His degree in outdoor recreation from Colorado State University had prepared him for leading nature hikes and teaching kids to build fires, not for understanding that the occasional bear scat they'd encounter on the trails around Camp Timber belonged to a massive boar grizzly who had been steadily expanding his territory throughout the spring of 2024. The third vehicle in their small convoy was Hannah Marie Brooks's Ford Explorer, its back seat packed with the camping gear and first aid supplies that reflected her practical nature. At 23, Hannah was the most experienced outdoors woman of the three, having grown up in Missoula, where black bears were common visitors to backyard garbage cans. Her father, retired Forest Service Ranger Dale Brooks, had taught her to make noise while hiking and never to run from a bear. He had not taught her what to do when a grizzly bear, driven by territorial instinct and the approaching mating season, decides that the humans in his domain pose a threat that must be eliminated with extreme prejudice. The three counselors had met during their interview weekend at Camp Timber in March, when the Glacier National Park region was still locked in winter's grip, and the idea of bear encounters seemed abstract and manageable. Camp Director Patricia "Patty" Hendricks, a weathered 58-year-old who had been running wilderness camps for 3 decades, had covered bear safety in a single 40-minute session that focused primarily on proper food storage and making noise while hiking. She had not mentioned that the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks had documented increasing grizzly bear activity in the immediate area throughout 2023 and early 2024. Nor that 3 separate bear researchers had recommended posting warning signs about Bear 211, whose tracking collar indicated he was spending increasing amounts of time in the wooded areas directly adjacent to Camp Timber's property boundaries. Dr. Sarah Chen, a wildlife biologist with the University of Montana who had been studying grizzly bear behavior in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem for 8 years, would later testify during the inevitable investigation that Bear 211 exhibited classic territorial behavior patterns that should have triggered enhanced safety protocols at any nearby human facilities. The bear, estimated to be 12 years old and at peak physical condition, had established a territory that encompassed roughly 40 square miles of dense forest, alpine meadows, and riparian areas, including the 320 acres that Camp Timber called home. The camp itself sat in a natural clearing surrounded by old-growth Douglas fir and western larch, with Timber Creek meandering along its northern boundary. The main lodge, built from local logs in 1987, housed the dining hall, kitchen, and administrative offices. 12 cabins arranged in a rough horseshoe shape provided sleeping quarters for up to 96 campers and 24 staff members. Cabin 7, where Rebecca, Tyler, and Hannah would be living during their 10-week employment period, was positioned at the far eastern end of the camp, approximately 230 yards from the main lodge and closest to the tree line that marked the boundary between human civilization and true wilderness. Rebecca parked her Civic next to the camp's maintenance shed and stepped out into the crisp mountain air, breathing deeply of the scent of pine resin and the distant promise of snow from the peaks visible through the clearing. The elevation here was 3,847 feet above sea level, high enough that nights would remain cool even during the height of summer. She pulled her duffel bag from the trunk, its weight familiar from her 4 years of summer camp experiences, first as a camper and later as a counselor in training. Her parents, Michael and Susan Lane from Bozeman, had supported her decision to spend another summer working with children, despite their quiet concerns about her being so far from home. They could not have imagined that their daughter's final text message to them would be sent at 8:43 p.m. on June 13th, reading simply, "Good night, love you both, can't wait for the kids to arrive tomorrow." Tyler emerged from his Subaru with characteristic enthusiasm, his tall frame unfolding from the driver's seat as he stretched muscles cramped from the 3-hour drive from Missoula, where he had been staying with college friends, while waiting for his camp timber employment to begin. His backpack contained his wilderness first aid certification, earned just 2 months earlier, along with detailed notes about child psychology and group management techniques. The first aid kit he carried would prove woefully inadequate for treating the traumatic injuries that would occur 71 hours and 37 minutes later, when Bear 211's initial charge would send Tyler sprawling backward over a wooden chair, his right femur snapping audibly as 4-inch claws raked down his chest, opening 4 parallel furrows that would expose his ribcage to the Montana night air. Hannah's arrival completed their small group, her movements efficient and purposeful as she unloaded her gear with the practiced motions of someone comfortable in the outdoors. Her father had insisted she carry bear spray, a precaution that would ultimately save her life. Though not before Bear 211's initial attack left her with injuries that would require 17 surgeries over the following 8 months and leave her permanently disfigured, despite the heroic efforts of the trauma team at Kalispell Regional Medical Center. The 3 counselors spent their first afternoon exploring the campgrounds, familiarizing themselves with the layout that would become a life-or-death maze of obstacles and escape routes. The dining hall featured large windows facing west toward the lake, offering spectacular sunset views that would distract them from noticing the massive paw prints in the soft earth outside Cabin 7's back door on the evening of June 13th. Those prints, measuring 9 3/4 inches from pad to claw tips, belonged to Bear 211, and indicated he had spent considerable time investigating the cabin where human scents were strongest. Camp Director Patty Hendricks conducted the mandatory safety briefing on their second day, covering standard wilderness protocols, while 47 children from across Montana and Wyoming prepared to arrive for the first session of what was supposed to be Camp Timber's most successful summer in its 37-year history. Patty's presentation included a 15-minute segment on bear awareness, during which she emphasized the importance of securing food and making noise while hiking. She did not mention the incident report filed with Flathead County Sheriff's Department just 2 weeks earlier, when camp maintenance worker Jorge Valdez had discovered that something large had torn apart the camp's garbage storage area, leaving behind scat containing berry seeds and what appeared to be fragments of small animal bones. Jorge Valdez, 53 years old and a 20-year employee of Camp Timber, had worked in bear country long enough to recognize sign when he saw it. The damage to the garbage area showed clear evidence of a large bear with tremendous strength. Metal garbage can lids had been crushed as easily as aluminum foil, and deep claw marks scored the wooden fence posts. Jorge had mentioned his concerns to Patty Hendricks, who had assured him that bears were just part of the territory and that proper garbage storage would resolve any issues. Jorge's unease would prove prophetic when, 72 hours later, he would be the first person to hear Hannah Brooks's screams echoing across the campgrounds at 2:17 a.m. on June 15th. The first campers began arriving at 3 p.m. on June 14th. Their parents dropping them off with the mixture of excitement and anxiety that marks the beginning of summer camp experiences. Rebecca had been assigned to counsel the Osprey group, 8 girls aged 11 to 13, whose enthusiasm for their wilderness adventure masked their complete ignorance about the realities of living in grizzly bear habitat. Tyler would be working with the Eagles, 10 boys whose ages ranged from 12 to 14 and whose bravado about camping in real wilderness would evaporate entirely when news of the attack reached their parents in the pre-dawn hours of June 15th. Hannah had drawn assignment with the Ravens, a mixed group of older teenagers who had specifically requested a more challenging outdoor experience. These kids, aged 15 to 17, would be sleeping in platform tents rather than the heated cabins used by younger campers, placing them in an even more vulnerable position should Bear 211 decide to expand his nocturnal investigations beyond the councillor quarters. The platform tents were located approximately 150 yards southeast of Cabin 7, positioned in a cluster of Douglas fir trees that would provide perfect concealment for a predator capable of moving through forest undergrowth with surprising stealth despite weighing more than a quarter ton. The evening of June 14th unfolded with the controlled chaos typical of summer camp beginnings. Dinner in the main lodge featured hamburgers and potato salad, with all 47 campers talking excitedly about the adventures that awaited them. Rebecca found herself genuinely enjoying the energy of her Osprey girls, particularly Maya Schneider, a precocious 12-year-old from Billings whose rapid-fire questions about local wildlife revealed a sharp curiosity about the natural world. Rebecca patiently answered questions about elk, moose, and mountain lions, unconsciously avoiding any detailed discussion of grizzly bears, despite Maya's repeated attempts to steer the conversation toward what she called the really dangerous animals. Tyler's Eagles proved to be a boisterous group whose collective enthusiasm for wilderness adventure was matched only by their complete lack of practical outdoor experience. 13-year-old Brandon Mills from Cheyenne had never been camping without electricity and running water, while his tent mate Jake Rodriguez from Missoula had never seen a black bear despite living in Montana his entire life. The boys peppered Tyler with questions about bear encounters, snake bites, and mountain lion attacks, treating the dangers of wilderness living as exciting abstractions rather than genuine threats requiring serious preparation and respect. Hannah's Ravens presented a different challenge entirely. These older teenagers had specifically chosen Camp Timber for its reputation as a more serious wilderness experience, and several had previous camping experience that made them somewhat knowledgeable about outdoor hazards. 17-year-old Sarah Kim from Spokane had completed a wilderness survival course with the National Outdoor Leadership School, while her friend Marcus Thompson from Great Falls was an Eagle Scout with extensive backpacking experience. Both teenagers would later provide detailed witness statements about the unusual sounds they heard coming from the direction of Cabin 7 during the early morning hours of June 15th, testimony that would prove crucial in reconstructing the timeline of Bear 211's attack. As evenings settled over Camp Timber, the temperature dropped from the day's high of 73 degrees to a crisp 52 degrees, typical for mid-June at their elevation. The drop in temperature would later prove significant as grizzly bears are more active during cooler periods, and Bear 211's tracking data would show increased movement during the overnight hours of June 14th to 15th. At 9:30 p.m., all campers were required to be in their respective sleeping areas, with councillors conducting final head counts and settling any last-minute anxieties about first nights away from home. Rebecca's final rounds with the Osprey girls took her to Cabin 3, where Maya Schneider was having difficulty falling asleep due to the unfamiliar forest sounds outside their windows. Rebecca spent 20 minutes sitting on the edge of Maya's bunk, explaining the difference between normal wilderness sounds, wind in the trees, the distant call of a great horned owl, the rustle of small mammals in the underbrush, and anything that might indicate a genuine threat. She assured Maya that the camp had never experienced a serious wildlife encounter, a statement that was technically accurate, but failed to account for the fact that Camp Timber had never before operated during a summer when a territorial grizzly bear had established such a strong presence in the immediate area. Tyler finished his duties with the Eagles at 10:15 p.m. after mediating a minor dispute between Brandon Mills and his cabin mate over who would get the top bunk. Tyler's natural warmth and humor quickly diffused the situation, leaving both boys laughing about their silly argument. As Tyler walked across the campgrounds toward Cabin 7, he noted the spectacular clarity of the night sky, where the absence of light pollution allowed the Milky Way to stretch across the heavens in brilliant detail. He paused to identify several constellations, unaware that less than 4 hours later, those same stars would be obscured by clouds as a summer thunderstorm moved through the area, muffling the sounds of his death screams so effectively that campers in the nearest cabin would sleep through the entire attack. Hannah completed her evening responsibilities at 10:45 p.m. after helping Marcus Thompson replace a broken tent zipper that would have left his platform tent vulnerable to insects and weather. Her practical skills and calm demeanor had already established her as a favorite among the older teenagers, who appreciated her straightforward approach to problem-solving and her obvious competence in outdoor situations. As she walked the well-worn path back to Cabin 7, Hannah automatically scanned the tree line, out of habit learned from her father, though she saw nothing more threatening than the occasional glint of reflected starlight from the eyes of small nocturnal mammals going about their business in the forest understory. The three counselors reconvened in Cabin 7 at 11 p.m., their shared living space modest but comfortable. The cabin featured 3 single beds, a small table with 2 chairs, and a compact bathroom with a shower that provided lukewarm water on good days. A propane heater would provide warmth during cooler nights, though none of the 3 counselors expected to need it during their June arrival. The cabin's single door faced west toward the main camp, while 2 windows offered views to the north and south. The absence of an east-facing window meant that none of them would see Bear 211 when he first approached their cabin at approximately 1:45 a.m., his massive form moving with surprising silence through the Douglas fir trees that grew within 15 feet of their back wall. Their conversation that first evening covered the typical topics of summer camp staff, comparing notes about their assigned campers, discussing plans for the following day's activities, and sharing stories about their own summer camp experiences as children. Rebecca mentioned her excitement about leading her first overnight camping trip, scheduled for later in the week, while Tyler expressed some nervousness about managing his group of energetic boys during more challenging activities like rock climbing and wilderness navigation. Hannah, characteristically practical, focused on logistics and safety protocols, reviewing the camp's emergency procedures and discussing the location of radio equipment and first aid supplies. At 11:47 p.m., they were interrupted by sounds from the forest, a series of breaking branches, and what sounded like heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush approximately 50 yards east of their cabin. The sounds continued for several minutes, accompanied by occasional snuffling and huffing noises that Rebecca initially attributed to elk or moose. Tyler, whose suburban Colorado upbringing had not prepared him to distinguish between different large mammal sounds, suggested they investigate with flashlights. Hannah, drawing on her father's teachings about wildlife behavior, argued for staying inside and monitoring the situation from their windows. The debate proved academic when the sounds gradually moved away toward the north, fading into the general symphony of forest noises that provided the constant background soundtrack for life at Camp Timber. None of the 3 counselors recognized what they had heard as the feeding sounds of a large grizzly bear working his way through a patch of serviceberry bushes, the same bear who had been monitoring their cabin and learning their routines for the past 5 days. Bear 211's exceptional intelligence and adaptability, traits that had allowed him to thrive in an ecosystem increasingly impacted by human development, were now being applied to the problem of these new arrivals in his territory. At 12:23 a.m. on June 15th, the 3 counselors settled into their respective beds, exhausted from the day's activities and looking forward to what they expected would be an uneventful night's sleep before their first full day of camp activities. Rebecca fell asleep almost immediately, her natural optimism and physical tiredness combining to produce deep, dreamless sleep that would continue until Bear 211's initial assault on their door at 2:17 a.m. Tyler took longer to fall asleep, his mind racing with plans for the following day's activities and occasional worries about whether he was adequately prepared for the responsibilities of wilderness counseling. He finally drifted off around 1:10 a.m., entering the REM sleep phase, just as Bear 211 was approaching the campgrounds for his final investigation of the human interlopers in his domain. Hannah, ever practical and alert to her surroundings, had positioned her bear spray on the small table next to her bed before falling asleep. This decision, made purely from ingrained caution rather than any specific sense of threat, would prove crucial in the events that followed. She fell asleep at approximately 12:45 a.m., her body relaxed but her subconscious mind remaining partially alert to unusual sounds. A survival adaptation that her father had encouraged through years of wilderness camping, and that would save her life when Bear 211's attack began. The weather conditions during the overnight hours of June 14th to 15th were nearly ideal for grizzly bear activity. The temperature held steady at 48 degrees with minimal wind, allowing scents to carry effectively through the forest and giving Bear 211 optimal conditions for using his extraordinary sense of smell to track human activity. Humidity levels were moderate, preventing the ground from becoming too dry and noisy for stealthy movement. A partial moon provided enough light for the bear's excellent night vision while casting shadows that offered concealment for his approach to the cabin. At 1:30 a.m., Bear 211 emerged from the dense forest cover approximately 100 yards east of Cabin 7. His tracking collar, monitored by researchers at the University of Montana, would later show that he had remained in the immediate area for the previous 4 hours, apparently observing the camp and learning the patterns of human activity. The bear's behavior during this period was consistent with what wildlife biologists call investigative stalking, a hunting technique rarely documented in grizzly bears, but not unprecedented when territorial males encounter what they perceive as a threat to their domain. The massive grizzly moved with remarkable stealth for an animal weighing 612 pounds, his broad paws finding purchase on the forest floor with practiced silence. Years of successful hunting and territorial defense had taught Bear 211 to approach potential threats or prey with maximum tactical advantage. And his approach to Cabin 7 demonstrated the intelligence and adaptability that made him one of the region's most successful breeding males. Each step was deliberate and controlled, his massive head swaying slightly as he processed the complex mixture of scents emanating from the human dwelling. At 1:45 a.m., Bear 211 reached the back wall of Cabin 7 and began what researchers would later classify as scent investigation behavior. His sensitive nose, capable of detecting odors up to 18 miles away under optimal conditions, analyzed the human scents concentrated around the cabin's exterior. The bear spent approximately 22 minutes circling the structure, his investigation including detailed examination of the cabin's single door, both windows, and the small area where camp regulations required the 3 counselors to store any food items in bear-resistant containers. During this investigation period, Bear 211's behavior showed clear signs of increasing agitation and territorial aggression. His breathing became more audible, characterized by the huffing and jaw-popping sounds that grizzly bear experts recognize as warning signs of impending aggressive action. The bear's body language, captured partially by motion-activated trail cameras positioned throughout the campgrounds for wildlife monitoring purposes, showed classic pre-attack posturing, including raised hackles, lowered head position, and the distinctive ear-pinning behavior that indicates a grizzly bear has decided to eliminate a perceived threat. At 2:07 a.m., Bear 211's investigation was interrupted by sounds from inside Cabin 7 as Hannah Brooks shifted positions in her sleep, her movement causing the old wooden bed frame to creak audibly. The sound triggered an immediate behavioral change in the bear, whose territorial instincts interpreted any human activity during his investigation as a direct challenge to his dominance. Bear 211 responded by moving to the cabin's front door and beginning what wildlife experts term testing behavior, using his considerable strength to probe the structural integrity of potential barriers between himself and perceived threats. The cabin door, constructed from standard residential materials rather than the reinforced barriers required for structures in high-risk grizzly bear areas, proved wholly inadequate for restraining a determined 612-pound predator. Bear 211's initial testing involved pushing against the door with his massive shoulder, exerting approximately 800 pounds of pressure against the simple doorknob and deadbolt locking mechanism. The door frame, constructed from 2x4 lumber and designed for normal residential security rather than wildlife protection, began showing signs of structural failure within seconds of Bear 211's first serious push. At 2:17 a.m., Bear 211 committed fully to his assault on Cabin 7. Using a combination of shoulder pressure and claw attacks, the massive grizzly bear breached the cabin door in less than 15 seconds, the sound of splintering wood and twisted metal exploding through the quiet night air like a thunderclap. The door's failure was complete and catastrophic, with the deadbolt mechanism tearing completely free from the wooden doorframe and the door itself hanging at an impossible angle, its hinges destroyed by forces far exceeding their design parameters. Hannah Brooks awoke instantly to the sound of destruction, her wilderness-trained instincts providing immediate recognition of extreme danger even before her conscious mind fully processed what was happening. Her hand found her bear spray within 2 seconds of awakening, muscle memory from years of outdoor experience guiding her movements, even as her mind struggled to comprehend the impossible reality of a grizzly bear standing in the destroyed doorway of their cabin. The bear's massive silhouette filled the entire doorframe, backlit by starlight and appearing even larger than his actual considerable size due to the low angle and Hannah's position on her bed. Rebecca Lane's awakening was slower and more confused, her deep sleep requiring several seconds to give way to consciousness, even as the sounds of destruction continued. Her first coherent thought was that a tree had fallen on their cabin, a rational but tragically incorrect assessment that cost her precious seconds of reaction time. By the time Rebecca's mind processed the true nature of their situation, Bear 211 had already moved fully inside Cabin 7 and was advancing toward Tyler Scott's bed with the purposeful gait of a predator that has identified its primary target. Tyler Scott's awakening came at the moment when Bear 211's massive paw, armed with 4-inch claws honed by years of digging and territorial combat, made contact with his chest. The young man's confused emergence from sleep was instantly replaced by indescribable agony as the bear's claws penetrated through his cotton t-shirt, skin, muscle tissue, and into the intercostal spaces between his ribs. Tyler's scream, a sound that would haunt Hannah Brooks for the remainder of her life, lasted less than 3 seconds before Bear 211's second swipe caught him across the throat, severing his carotid artery and essentially guaranteeing his death within minutes, regardless of any medical intervention that might have been available. Hannah's response to Tyler's attack was immediate and decisive, her father's wilderness training overriding the natural human tendency to freeze in the face of overwhelming terror. She discharged her bear spray from a distance of approximately 8 feet, the pressurized capsaicin compound, creating a cone of chemical irritant designed to deter aggressive wildlife. The spray had an immediate effect on Bear 211, causing him to rear back on his hind legs and paw at his face in obvious distress, but the enclosed space of the cabin meant that all three humans were also exposed to the chemical irritant, adding to the chaos and confusion of the attack situation. Rebecca's attempt to escape toward the cabin's destroyed door proved fatal when Bear 211, partially blinded by the bear spray but still driven by territorial rage, struck out wildly with his right paw. The blow caught Rebecca in the lower back with sufficient force to lift her entirely off the ground and send her crashing into the cabin's north wall. The impact was devastating, crushing 3 lumbar vertebrae and causing massive internal bleeding from ruptured organs. Rebecca's death was not immediate, but the nature of her injuries made survival impossible, even with prompt medical attention that would not arrive for another 43 minutes. Hannah's survival depended entirely on reaching the cabin's destroyed door before Bear 211 could recover sufficiently from the bear spray to mount another attack. Her dash across the small cabin required exactly 4 seconds, during which the partially incapacitated bear was attempting to clear the chemical irritant from his eyes and respiratory system. Hannah's escape through the doorway was successful, but Bear 211's reflexive swipe as she passed caught her across the left side of her face, his claws opening 4 parallel wounds that would require plastic surgeons to work for nearly 6 hours to repair during her initial trauma surgery. The attack sequence inside Cabin 7 lasted exactly 7 minutes and 14 seconds from initial door breach to Bear 211's departure from the structure. During this period, Tyler Scott and Rebecca Lane sustained injuries that proved fatal, despite the heroic efforts of emergency medical personnel, while Hannah Brooks survived with traumatic injuries that would require months of surgical reconstruction and rehabilitation. Bear 211, having eliminated what his territorial instincts identified as threats to his domain, departed the cabin and moved northeast toward the dense forest cover that had concealed his approach. Hannah's flight from Cabin 7 took her directly toward the main lodge, her screams for help awakening maintenance worker Jorge Valdez, who had been sleeping in quarters attached to the camp's workshop facility. Jorge's immediate response was to activate the camp's emergency communication system, placing simultaneous calls to the Flathead County Sheriff's Department, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and the camp's medical emergency contacts. His call to 911, placed at 2:24 a.m., would initiate a complex rescue and investigation effort involving multiple agencies and ultimately leading to one of the most comprehensive studies of grizzly bear behavior ever conducted in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. The emergency response to the attack at Camp Timber involved coordination between Flathead County Search and Rescue, the Montana Department of Fish and Game, Wildlife and Parks, the United States Forest Service, and multiple medical facilities throughout the region. The remote location of the camp, combined with the ongoing threat posed by Bear 211's continued presence in the area, created unprecedented challenges for first responders attempting to provide emergency medical care and secure the scene for investigation. Flathead County Sheriff Marcus Rodriguez received the initial emergency call at 2:26 a.m., while sleeping at his home in Kalispell. Sheriff Rodriguez, a 23-year law enforcement veteran with extensive experience in wilderness emergency response, immediately recognized the complexity of the situation and initiated protocols for major incident response. His first call was to Deputy Sarah Mitchell, the department's wildlife specialist, who would serve as the primary liaison with state and federal wildlife management agencies during the investigation and recovery efforts. The first emergency vehicles to respond were Kalispell Rural Fire Department units, which were already positioned at the volunteer fire station approximately 8 miles from Camp Timber. Fire Chief David Thompson and paramedic Lisa Chen arrived at the camp at 2:41 a.m., finding Hannah Brooks conscious but in severe shock from blood loss and trauma. Initial assessment revealed extensive facial lacerations, a probable concussion, and defensive wounds on both hands, consistent with attempting to fight off a large animal attack. Paramedic Chen's immediate priority was controlling bleeding and preventing shock, while preparing Hannah for emergency transport to Kalispell Regional Medical Center. The condition of Tyler Scott and Rebecca Lane presented different challenges entirely. Tyler's injuries were immediately recognized as fatal, with massive blood loss from severed carotid and subclavian arteries, making any resuscitation attempt futile. Rebecca remained technically alive upon the arrival of first responders, but the massive internal trauma from Bear 211's attack had caused irreversible organ damage and internal bleeding that could not be controlled with field medical equipment. She died at 3:17 a.m. while emergency medical technicians were preparing her for helicopter transport, her death officially attributed to massive internal hemorrhaging from blunt force trauma. The ongoing threat posed by Bear 211's presence in the immediate area created significant complications for emergency response efforts. Montana Fish Wildlife and Parks Bear Specialist Robert Bear Davidson arrived at Camp Timber at 3:33 a.m., equipped with specialized tracking equipment and protocols for dealing with aggressive grizzly bears in populated areas. Davidson's assessment of the scene confirmed that the attack was consistent with territorial behavior rather than predatory hunting, meaning that Bear 211 would likely remain in the vicinity and continue to view humans in the area as threats requiring elimination. The decision to evacuate all campers and remaining staff from Camp Timber was made at 4:15 a.m., following consultation between Sheriff Rodriguez, Bear Specialist Davidson, and Camp Director Patty Hendricks. The evacuation required coordination with parents throughout Montana and Wyoming, many of whom faced drives of several hours to retrieve their children from what had been advertised as a safe and supervised wilderness experience. The evacuation was completed by 8:30 a.m., with the last vehicles leaving the campgrounds under escort by Flathead County Sheriff's Department personnel. Dr. Michael Harrison, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Kalispell Regional Medical Center, had been alerted to expect a major trauma case at 2:45 a.m. and had assembled a full surgical team by the time Hannah Brooks arrived by helicopter at 3:52 a.m. Initial examination revealed the extent of her injuries: 4 parallel facial lacerations extending from her left temple to her jawline, each approximately 6 inches long and ranging from 1 to 2 inches deep. Defensive wounds on both hands requiring tendon repair, a moderate concussion with associated cognitive symptoms, and psychological trauma requiring immediate psychiatric consultation. The surgical repair of Hannah's facial injuries required the coordinated efforts of Dr. Harrison, plastic surgeon Dr. Jennifer Kim, and ophthalmologist Dr. Robert Chen, whose specialty was required due to damage near Hannah's left eye socket. The initial surgery lasted 5 hours and 47 minutes, during which the surgical team worked to repair damaged muscles, reattach severed nerves, and minimize scarring that would otherwise leave Hannah permanently disfigured. Despite their expertise and dedication, the nature of her injuries guaranteed that Hannah would require additional reconstructive surgeries and would never fully recover her original appearance. The investigation into Bear 211's attack began immediately following the evacuation of Camp Timber, with Bear Specialist Davidson leading a team of wildlife experts in documenting the scene and tracking the bear's movements before and after the attack. The investigation would ultimately reveal a pattern of escalating territorial behavior that had gone unrecognized by camp management, despite clear warning signs throughout the spring and early summer of 2024. Trail camera footage, paw print analysis, and scat examination would provide a detailed timeline of Bear 211's increasing focus on Camp Timber as a territorial threat requiring aggressive response. Dr. Sarah Chen's research into grizzly bear behavior in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem provided crucial context for understanding Bear 211's attack on the camp counselors. Her analysis of GPS tracking data from the bear's collar showed that he had been spending increasing amounts of time in the immediate vicinity of Camp Timber, beginning in early May, with his movement patterns indicating systematic investigation of the facility's buildings and activity areas. This behavior, combined with the approaching mating season and the bear's previous territorial disputes with other males in the region, created a perfect storm of aggression factors that made an attack increasingly likely. The media response to the Camp Timber attack was immediate and intense, with regional and national news outlets providing extensive coverage of what many described as the worst grizzly bear attack in Montana's recent history. The tragic deaths of Rebecca Lane and Tyler Scott, combined with Hannah Brooks's survival and traumatic injuries, created a compelling narrative that captured public attention and sparked widespread debate about wilderness safety and grizzly bear management policies throughout the northern Rocky Mountains. Rebecca's parents, Michael and Susan Lane, learned of their daughter's death through a phone call from Flathead County Sheriff Rodriguez at 6:15 a.m. on June 15th. The devastating news reached them at their Bozeman home while they were preparing for what they expected to be a normal Saturday morning, completely unaware that their daughter had been dead for more than 3 hours. Michael Lane, a high school history teacher, and Susan Lane, a pediatric nurse, had supported Rebecca's passion for outdoor education and summer camp work, never imagining that her dedication to helping children appreciate the natural world would ultimately cost her life. Tyler Scott's parents, James and Maria Scott of Denver, Colorado, received similar notification at 6:42 a.m. Mountain Time, the delay resulting from initial difficulties in contacting them due to incorrect emergency contact information in Tyler's employment files. James Scott, a mechanical engineer, and Maria Scott, a social worker specializing in childhood trauma, had been proud of their son's decision to dedicate his summer to outdoor education, despite their own urban backgrounds and limited understanding of wilderness risks. The irony that Maria's professional expertise in helping children cope with traumatic experiences could not protect her from the devastation of losing her own son would become a recurring theme in the family's long struggle to cope with their loss. Hannah Brooks's parents, Dale and Patricia Brooks of Missoula, arrived at Kalispell Regional Medical Center at 7:23 a.m., having made the 90-minute drive through mountain highways while their daughter underwent her initial reconstructive surgery. Dale Brooks's experience as a retired Forest Service ranger provided him with a realistic understanding of Hannah's injuries and the long-term challenges she would face, while Patricia Brooks, an elementary school principal, focused on the immediate medical and psychological support their daughter would require during her recovery. The investigation into Bear 211's background revealed a complex history of territorial disputes and human-wildlife conflicts that had been inadequately documented and communicated to facilities operating in his territory. Born in Glacier National Park in 2012, Bear 211 had been orphaned at approximately 18 months old when his mother was killed in a vehicle collision on Going to the Sun Road. His survival as a subadult male was remarkable, requiring exceptional intelligence and adaptability that would later contribute to his territorial success, but also to his aggressive response to perceived human threats. Research conducted by Dr. Chen and her colleagues showed that Bear 211 had been involved in at least 3 previous incidents involving human property damage, including the destruction of a backcountry cabin in 2022 and aggressive encounters with hikers in Glacier National Park during the 2023 season. None of these incidents had resulted in human injury, largely due to the remote locations and the quick retreat of humans when confronted by the massive bear. The Camp Timber attack represented a significant escalation in Bear 211's territorial behavior, likely triggered by the permanent human presence in his established territory and the approaching peak of mating season, when male grizzly bears are particularly aggressive toward any perceived threats. The tracking operation to locate and capture Bear 211 began at first light on June 15th. With a team of specialists from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the United States Forest Service, and tribal wildlife management authorities from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. The operation was complicated by Bear 211's exceptional intelligence and his intimate knowledge of the terrain, factors that allowed him to evade capture for 6 days while remaining in the general vicinity of Camp Timber. The bear's continued presence in the area effectively prevented any possibility of reopening the camp and created ongoing safety concerns for the numerous emergency personnel and investigators working at the site. Dr. Patricia Walsh, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma recovery, was brought in to provide immediate counseling services for the surviving campers and staff members who had experienced the terror of being evacuated from a wilderness camp following a fatal bear attack. Dr. Walsh's assessment revealed that several children were experiencing symptoms consistent with acute stress reaction, including sleep disturbances, anxiety about outdoor activities, and intrusive thoughts about bear attacks. The psychological impact of the Camp Timber incident would prove to be long-lasting, with several campers requiring ongoing therapy throughout the remainder of 2024 and into 2025. Hannah Brooks's recovery process began with her emergence from post-surgical sedation on the afternoon of June 15th. Approximately 14 hours after Bear 211's attack had ended her summer camp experience and changed her life forever. Her first coherent memory following the attack was the sensation of facial bandages restricting her movement and speech, followed quickly by the realization that her survival had come at the cost of her friends' lives. The survivor's guilt that would plague Hannah throughout her recovery was compounded by her clear memories of the attack sequence, including Tyler's final scream and Rebecca's desperate attempt to escape through the cabin's destroyed doorway. The forensic analysis of Cabin 7 provided crucial evidence for understanding both the sequence of Bear 211's attack and the inadequacy of standard residential construction for buildings located in high-risk grizzly bear habitat. The completely destroyed doorframe, claw marks gouged into the cabin's interior walls, and blood evidence patterns allowed investigators to reconstruct the 7-minute attack with unusual precision. The analysis revealed that Bear 211 had focused his initial aggression on Tyler Scott, likely because Tyler's movements and vocalizations during the early seconds of the attack identified him as the primary threat requiring elimination. Camp Director Patty Hendricks faced immediate questioning from investigators about the adequacy of safety protocols at Camp Timber, particularly regarding bear awareness training and emergency response procedures. Her 30 years of wilderness camp management experience had never included a serious bear encounter, leading to what investigators characterized as institutional complacency regarding grizzly bear risks despite operating in prime grizzly habitat. The investigation would ultimately recommend significant changes to safety protocols for wilderness camps throughout the northern Rocky Mountain region. The economic impact of the Camp Timber attack extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of lives lost and forever changed. The camp's closure for the remainder of the 2024 season resulted in approximately $1.2 million in lost revenue, while legal settlements with the families of Tyler Scott and Rebecca Lane would ultimately exceed $3.8 million. Insurance companies throughout the region began reassessing policies for wilderness recreation facilities, leading to significant increases in premiums and requirements for enhanced safety protocols in grizzly bear habitat. Dr. Jennifer Kim's assessment of Hannah Brooks's long-term prognosis was cautiously optimistic regarding functional recovery, but realistic about cosmetic outcomes. The 4 parallel scars extending across the left side of Hannah's face would remain visible despite multiple reconstructive surgeries, serving as permanent reminders of her encounter with Bear 211. Dr. Kim's treatment plan included 17 separate surgical procedures over 8 months, each designed to address specific aspects of tissue repair, nerve reconnection, and scar reduction. The total cost of Hannah's medical treatment would ultimately exceed $450,000, largely covered by workers' compensation insurance, but placing significant financial strain on her family during the recovery period. The capture of Bear 211 finally occurred on June 21st, following a complex operation that involved tranquilizer darts, tracking dogs, and a team of 12 wildlife specialists working in coordination across 40 square miles of wilderness terrain. The bear was discovered in a dense thicket approximately 3 miles northeast of Camp Timber, where he had remained largely stationary for the previous 36 hours. The decision to euthanize Bear 211 rather than relocate him was made based on his demonstrated willingness to attack humans and the extreme likelihood that similar incidents would occur if he were moved to another area with human presence. The necropsy performed on Bear 211 revealed a magnificent physical specimen at peak condition, weighing exactly 612 pounds and showing no signs of disease or injury that might have contributed to his aggressive behavior. His stomach contents included service berries, elk calf remains, and human fabric consistent with clothing worn by the attack victims, confirming investigators' reconstruction of his activities during and after the assault on Cabin 7. The bear's exceptional size and physical condition supported researchers' conclusions that his attack was motivated by territorial dominance rather than hunger or defensive behavior. Memorial services for Rebecca Lane and Tyler Scott were held in their respective home communities, drawing hundreds of mourners who had been touched by their dedication to youth development and outdoor education. Rebecca's memorial service at Montana State University, where she had earned her degree in elementary education, featured testimonials from professors and fellow students who remembered her infectious enthusiasm for sharing her love of nature with children. Tyler's service in Denver was attended by numerous campers from previous summers, who had been inspired by his patient teaching style and genuine care for helping young people build confidence through outdoor experiences. Hannah Brooks's first public appearance following the attack occurred during Tyler Scott's memorial service, where she delivered a brief eulogy, despite the obvious difficulty caused by her ongoing medical treatment and facial reconstruction. Her words, delivered through tears and limited by the physical constraints of her healing injuries, focused on Tyler's dedication to helping children overcome their fears and discover their capabilities in wilderness settings. Hannah's courage in attending the service and speaking publicly about her friend's dedication created a powerful moment that was widely covered by media outlets following the story. The wrongful death lawsuits filed by the families of Rebecca Lane and Tyler Scott against Camp Timber, its parent organization, and several equipment manufacturers alleged inadequate safety protocols, insufficient staff training, and failure to properly assess and respond to known wildlife threats in the area. The legal proceedings would ultimately result in significant settlements and changes to industry standards for wilderness camps operating in grizzly bear habitat, including requirements for reinforced construction materials, enhanced staff training, and improved communication with wildlife management agencies. Dr. Sarah Chen's comprehensive analysis of Bear 211's behavior, published in the Journal of Wildlife Management in March 2025, provided unprecedented insight into the territorial behavior of mature male grizzly bears and the factors that can trigger aggressive encounters with humans. Her research, based on GPS tracking data, trail camera footage, and detailed analysis of the attack scene, established new protocols for assessing and mitigating human grizzly bear conflicts in areas where wilderness recreation facilities operate near critical grizzly habitat. The psychological impact of the Camp Timber attack extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families, affecting the broader community of wilderness educators and outdoor recreation professionals throughout the region. Summer camps, wilderness therapy programs, and outdoor education centers implemented enhanced safety protocols and training programs, while some facilities temporarily suspended operations pending comprehensive safety reviews. The attack served as a stark reminder that wilderness recreation, while providing invaluable benefits for participants, involves inherent risks that require constant vigilance and professional expertise to manage safely. Hannah Brooks's return to outdoor activities began cautiously in September 2024, with short, supervised hikes in areas with minimal wildlife presence and extensive safety protocols. Her father, Dale, accompanied her on these initial outings, recognizing that overcoming her trauma would require gradual exposure to wilderness settings rather than complete avoidance of outdoor activities. Hannah's determination to eventually return to outdoor education work, despite the obvious challenges posed by her injuries and psychological trauma, demonstrated remarkable resilience and provided inspiration for other trauma survivors throughout the region. The legislative response to the Camp Timber attack included proposed changes to Montana state regulations governing wilderness recreation facilities in grizzly bear habitat. State Representative Maria Santos of Missoula introduced legislation requiring enhanced construction standards, mandatory bear safety training for all staff, improved communication protocols with wildlife management agencies, and regular safety audits by qualified professionals. The proposed legislation faced opposition from industry groups concerned about increased costs and regulatory burdens, but gained strong support from victim advocacy organizations and wilderness safety experts. The impact of social media coverage surrounding the Camp Timber attack created additional challenges for the families of victims and survivors, as graphic details and speculation about the incident spread rapidly across various platforms. The Brooks family was forced to hire a public relations consultant to manage media requests and protect Hannah's privacy during her recovery period, while the families of Rebecca Lane and Tyler Scott struggled with unwanted attention from true crime enthusiasts and wildlife photography hobbyists seeking to visit the attack site for social media content. Dr. Michael Harrison's follow-up assessment of Hannah Brooks 6 months after the attack revealed significant progress in her physical recovery, but ongoing challenges with post-traumatic stress symptoms, including hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, and anxiety related to outdoor activities. Dr. Harrison's treatment recommendations included continued psychiatric counseling, gradual exposure therapy for wilderness anxiety, and ongoing monitoring for signs of depression or suicidal ideation. Hannah's recovery would require extensive support from mental health professionals specialized in trauma recovery and wilderness-related PTSD. The financial impact of increased insurance premiums and safety requirements following the Camp Timber attack forced several smaller wilderness recreation facilities to close permanently. unable to afford the enhanced construction standards and staffing requirements needed to operate safely in grizzly bear habitat. The consolidation of the industry into fewer, better-funded operations resulted in reduced access to wilderness education programs for many families, particularly those from lower-income backgrounds who relied on subsidized camp experiences for their children's outdoor education. Bear specialist Robert Davidson's recommendations for preventing similar attacks focused on improved communication between wildlife management agencies and wilderness recreation facilities, enhanced training for camp staff in recognizing and responding to wildlife threats, and better integration of wildlife monitoring data into facility safety planning. Davidson's analysis of Bear 211's behavior patterns revealed multiple opportunities for early intervention that could have prevented the escalation to a fatal attack, emphasizing the importance of proactive rather than reactive approaches to human-wildlife conflict management. The creation of the Tyler Scott Memorial Scholarship Fund and the Rebecca Lane Wilderness Education Endowment provided positive legacies from the tragedy, supporting future generations of outdoor educators and wilderness camp participants. Both memorial funds focused on promoting safe wilderness education practices, while ensuring that the victims' dedication to sharing the wonder of nature with children would continue despite the tragic circumstances of their deaths. Hannah Brooks's involvement in both memorial funds, despite her own ongoing recovery challenges, demonstrated her commitment to honoring her friends' memories through continued support for wilderness education. The long-term monitoring of grizzly bear behavior in the Camp Timber area revealed significant changes in wildlife patterns following Bear 211's death and the intensive human activity during the investigation and cleanup efforts. Dr. Chen's research team documented the establishment of a new territorial arrangement among remaining bears in the ecosystem, with Bear 211's former territory being divided among 3 younger males, whose territorial behavior was markedly less aggressive toward human presence. This finding supported theories about the role of individual bear personality and experience in determining the likelihood of human-wildlife conflicts. Hannah Brooks's decision to pursue a master's degree in wildlife biology, with a focus on human grizzly bear conflict prevention, represented a remarkable transformation of her traumatic experience into a professional commitment to preventing similar tragedies. Her unique perspective as both an attack survivor and a trained wildlife professional provided unprecedented insights into the psychological and practical aspects of living and working in grizzly bear habitat. Hannah's research, conducted under the supervision of Dr. Sarah Chen, would eventually contribute to improved safety protocols for wilderness recreation facilities throughout North America. The 1-year anniversary of the Camp Timber attack was marked by memorial services for Rebecca Lane and Tyler Scott, attended by hundreds of individuals whose lives had been touched by the tragedy and its aftermath. Hannah Brooks spoke at both services, her physical recovery remarkable, but her emotional healing still ongoing. Her message focused on the importance of continuing Tyler and Rebecca's work in wilderness education while implementing the safety improvements needed to prevent similar tragedies. The anniversary also marked the completion of new safety standards for wilderness camps in grizzly bear habitat, standards that would be named the Lane Scott Protocols in honor of the victims. The establishment of the Camp Timber Memorial Park on the site of the former wilderness camp provided a permanent reminder of the tragedy while serving as an educational resource about grizzly bear behavior and wilderness safety. The park, developed through a partnership between the families of victims, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and the Forest Service, featured interpretive trails, educational displays about human-wildlife coexistence, and a memorial grove dedicated to Rebecca Lane and Tyler Scott. Hannah Brooks participated in the park's dedication ceremony, her presence serving as a powerful reminder of the human cost of inadequate safety protocols in wildlife habitat. The publication of Dr. Chen's comprehensive case study of Bear 211's behavior and the Camp Timber attack became required reading in wildlife management programs throughout North America, providing future professionals with detailed analysis of the factors that can lead to tragic human-wildlife conflicts. The case study's emphasis on proactive management, improved communication, and respect for wildlife behavior patterns influenced a generation of wildlife managers and outdoor recreation professionals, contributing to a significant reduction in serious bear attacks at managed facilities throughout the region. Hannah Brooks's eventual return to work as a wilderness educator 3 years after the attack that claimed her friends' lives and forever changed her own, represented the completion of a remarkable journey of recovery and resilience. Her decision to work specifically with programs serving at-risk youth, sharing her story as part of comprehensive safety education, demonstrated her commitment to transforming her traumatic experience into a force for positive change. Hannah's work continued to honor the memory of Rebecca Lane and Tyler Scott, while ensuring that their tragic deaths contributed to improved safety for future generations of wilderness camp participants and staff. The lasting impact of the Camp Timber attack extended far beyond the immediate tragedy, influencing wildlife management policies, wilderness recreation safety standards, and public understanding of the complex challenges involved in sharing landscapes with large predators. The deaths of Rebecca Lane and Tyler Scott, while tragic and preventable, ultimately contributed to safety improvements that protected countless future wilderness camp participants from similar dangers. Hannah Brooks's survival and remarkable recovery provided inspiration for other trauma survivors, while her continued work in wildlife education ensured that the lessons learned from June 15, 2024, would continue to save lives for years to come.